Hello, Ryan Peterson. Welcome to my YouTube channel.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to have a conversation today.
I'm really excited to have you on as well because you are one of the most active researchers in the old copper culture field of study in North America. You've been publishing over the last couple of years papers regarding travel, waste from mining, and that happens to be kind of a corresponding research interest of mine because I study the lake sediment records from the mining district areas where people were gathering copper. So I've been eager to talk to you. And every time you drop a paper, I'm on it. Like, I'm the first person that downloads it. I'm like, Ryan Peterson has a new paper out. You've done a lot of crazy, cool work with lead isotopes I want to talk about as well. But just so for the people that don't know, you are currently working for the Wisconsin Historical Society. You finished your PhD at Indiana University in the Department of Anthropology in 2024. Now tell me, what originally got you interested in the old copper complex? Start from the beginning.
Well, if I'm starting from the beginning, I'm going to actually go way back to my time as an undergraduate at Northern Michigan University. At the time, I was always interested in archaeology, and I decided to go to NMU to work with Dr. Scott Demel. I'm really the first archaeologist I ever met. It was just really cool to be standing in an archaeology lab. The lab at NMU was recently built. I think this was like their first year in the brand new lab. And it was just really an exciting experience. And at the time, I was really interested in what a lot of, I think, young archaeologists are, but like the classics, right? Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, that kind of stuff. And I went to school thinking, oh, I'd love to go and do that. But Dr. Demel is what you would call a Great Lakes archaeologist. And I went on his field school. I started taking classes from him. And over time, it's not that I lost interest in, say, the classics, but I really started to develop a new interest and a new passion for the archaeology here in the Great Lakes. And Dr. Demel would have speakers come in and have people from the Keweenaw come down and show us copper tools, and they'd show us some carvings up there. And it was really just an exciting to see all that. And then about right after I entered NMU, I was accepted into the McNair Scholars Program, which is really a program dedicated for people of underprivileged backgrounds, whether that be some sort of financial disadvantage or any sort of identity that maybe puts you at a disadvantage. And it's really for getting those individuals into graduate school. And it preps you for graduate school. They fund research opportunities. You attend classes, and they teach you all this stuff. Well, about my second year in that program, I walk into the director's office and she goes, "Hey, how would you like to go to Isle Royale for the summer?" And I thought, I'm from the Upper Peninsula. I vaguely knew about Isle Royale and the copper industry. And I said, "That sounds great." She goes, "Awesome. It's all arranged. All you have to do is essentially show up at the boat." And
What
so
year was this? What year was
this
this?
was 2017.
2017. Okay.
Yeah, the park archaeologist, Seth De Pasquale, he had reached out to me because, of course, I was going to go work with him. I'd never met him before. I never met anybody on Isle Royale before, and I showed up in Houghton with my bags packed to go spend the next 3-4 months there, never having met anybody. And they're on island, so this is before Isle Royale had even the ability to communicate outside of the island. So I get on the boat, and I have a 6-hour ride across Lake Superior from Houghton to Mott Island. And I didn't even know who I was looking for when I arrived. I got on the boat, I get off, because everybody else on the boat is like a park guest, right? They're there
Yeah.
to go hike Isle Royale, and you're like the one guy getting off on Mott Island. They're all going down to the park, yeah, to Rock Harbor. And I'm looking around, and this tall guy in glasses comes up to me. He goes, "You must be Ryan." I go, "You must be Seth." And it was just the start of an amazing summer on Isle Royale. I was really active involved in the Relic Shoreline survey that summer.
Mm-hmm.
I also got to work with Marley Chenoweth. She was great. Seth actually ditched out for most of that summer. His two twin boys were born that summer, which was awesome. So he got to go spend time with them. But that left Marley and I on Isle Royale doing Relic Shoreline survey, doing other kind of monitor activities. And as a McNair scholar, I also had to do a research project on Isle Royale. So I focused on a survey up in Todd Harbor where we looked at copper mines in that area, pre-contact copper mines. And we went and we kind of, lined up and walked through Isle Royale Wilderness, kind of picking out the mines and doing all that. Well, I left Isle Royale that summer, stayed in contact with Seth, went and finished my time at NMU, and then I wanted to go to grad school. So I started applying to grad schools, and I wanted to do copper, right? I wanted to research copper. I wanted to go get a degree in copper. Wasn't sure if I wanted a master's or a PhD at that point. And I went out and I started looking for people who researched that at different institutions. And at least at the time, and there may be people out there who watch this and think, what about me? But at the time, I couldn't find anybody who was doing that kind of research, who was doing that kind of work at an institution that you could either get a PhD at, possibly a master's. There were a couple people, but I really couldn't find anybody. And I kept applying and I kept talking to people. Great thing about the McNair scholars is they would send you to all these universities to go talk to the people, because part of their policy was if you want to get into grad school, you need to go meet people face to face. You need to go see who you're going to be working with. And I firmly believe that's true. And I went out and they would send me to this place or that place. And I applied to a bunch of places. And one of the places I applied was Indiana University. Now, I got a couple acceptance letters to where I was going, and I was debating between those schools. And one of them was going to let me work on copper, which was great. The other one would let me work on more modern copper mining, and that was also great. I was debating between those, and those are both master's programs. And then the last day that I had to decide, Indiana University reached out to me and they said, hey, we want to offer you a spot to come be in our PhD program. And they're like, we need a decision in like 2 days. I'm like, okay. So the McNair scholar sent me to Indiana. I met with the person that would be my advisor, and she was a lithic expert, which is what I said I wanted to do when I, wrote my thing. I said, hey, I'd love to work at lithics because that was also an interest of mine. And I sat down with Dr. April Siebert, and she looked at me and she said, you're interested in copper. She goes, I considered doing that for my dissertation. She goes, I couldn't find anybody to work with. She goes, so I did something else. She goes, come here, work with me, and we're going to let you work on copper. And I'm like, yes, please. And that's what
Wow.
really started me off, having somebody to essentially say, having April say like, hey, this might not be what I do, but you're going to do it because I wanted to and I couldn't do that. And that made the world to me. I don't know if I ever expressed that to April, but I was so excited to go to Indiana at the time, and I was just so looking forward to working on copper.
That is interesting. There's some parallels with how I got into studying old copper with lake sediments, because as an undergrad, I was working in a paleolimnology lab, which was studying lake sediment cores for climate change and other things. And the guy running the lab had studied pollution from the Incan and the Tiwanaku cultures in South America. And I was a geology undergrad, and I had taken an archaeology class. They brought up the old copper culture and said they got the copper from the mines and pits and quarries and what have you on the Keweenaw and Isle Royale. And I just went on my own and looked up if anyone had used the same method Mark had used in South America and Michigan, and no one had. And I went and talked to him. He's like, yeah, no one's done that. Do you want to do that? I was like, yeah, I'll do that. And he's, there's a little bit more exchange going on there. He's like, if you come to grad school, I'll support you to do that project. He was funded for parallel research, let's say, that I worked with as well. I helped basically run the lab and then worked on cores that I got funding to get my own stuff, like using GSA. He invited me to do a risky project that really trying to explain, let me use lake sediments to study ancient mining in Michigan. Some of our colleagues and some of the people I initially reached out to when Abbott supported me and was like, let's try this, they didn't think it was going to work.
Really?
So it was only, and I'm going to say this too from my advisor, only Mark Abbott who was like, hey, let's try it. There's only one way to find out. And also supporting me to get a whole Holocene length record, because at first we were thinking like 5,000 years. I think we ran 6,000 years at first. And then we saw a blip at like 5,500. And we're like, what's that? And it's in the middle of the core. And so we ran the whole thing. And then there was all these like little anomalies that look just like, they have the signature of anthropogenic pollution. There's no way to cut it. But yeah, having an advisor like that lets you pursue your interest. And that's interesting that you're looking for copper, couldn't find support. No one really was studying ancient copper in Michigan. And the birthplace of like American paleolimnology is Minnesota. So like studying lakes to study pollution and impacts from climate change in the prairie, and no one had actually used lake sediments to study mining pollution from indigenous copper mining in Michigan, right north of there. Anyway, so you said you're from the UP of Michigan? Where are
Yeah,
you from?
so I'm from a little town called Iron River, Michigan. It's on the Wisconsin border.
I
So
know
it's
that
actually an
place.
iron mining town, funny enough. For my interest in copper and my passion for copper, my ancestors were mining iron in that region in the 1800s and early 1900s.
Okay. I just drove through there this summer. Drove all through the UP and drove through Iron River, camped along a couple lakes. It was pretty nice. I was actually there working with North O2, the YouTube channel, which you may be aware of from the
I
old
am,
copper
yeah.
culture. He does really fantastic work, but we went up there and visited Larry Furrow this summer, and we're going to hopefully, that some of that video is going to be coming out soon. We're going to correspond with this interview that
So yeah, speaking of Larry, I mean, Larry is a phenomenal resource. He's a phenomenal guy. He actually co-hosted a copper workshop with me. I want to say it's last year, but my brain gets fuzzy, up in Thunder Bay
okay.
during the Ontario Archaeological Symposium, which was awesome. So Clarence was running that, and Larry and I were able to. We had a forge all going, and we had probably upwards of 100 people there working copper with us. I bought just bags and bags of float copper, just little pieces, and people could come in. We were heating the copper for them. We were having them work the copper, and it was really one of the best examples of like public experimental archaeology I've ever done. And Larry was so important in doing that and just sharing his knowledge with me.
Yeah, he really is. He's a treasure. He has so many ideas and so much experience with the material native copper in its raw form, which you realize when you finally get a piece of it and try to watch it being worked from raw form to a finished product. You realize there's things that only experience will tell you that you can't really learn. And Larry's the guy as close as we have that's alive today that has experience doing that.
It's true. I've seen a couple experiments done where you could tell the individual hadn't worked copper long, and it's not that the experiments were bad, but that lack of experience that say Larry has really adds to it. And I have nowhere near Larry's level of experience, but I strive one day to be close.
So I'm bringing you on today because I want to go over a couple papers that you've worked on in a chapter in this book. And I kind of want to break it up into main subjects or, focus areas because you cover a couple things and in your, broadly, let's say subjects, chapters within a larger picture because you looked at geochemistry, GIS, you looked at just kind of traditional archaeological analysis of waste. So you're actually kind of multidisciplinary in your approach to looking at the old copper culture, which is different than some of the older work too. So first thing I want to get into, and you may have talked about with Seth, is the marine least cost path approach that you're taking in the movement and the transfer of copper from Isle Royale. And you, in your paper, it's in 2022, it's called Maritime Least Cost Path Analysis, Archaic Travel Routes in the Upper Great Lakes. You look at what's the easiest way to get to like McCargo Cove, and there's a big mining district there. And what's the shortest path, considering a bunch of different factors, easiest path to like the North Shore and other trade routes? Can you maybe get into the details of that study and what you learned about what the least cost path would be to Isle Royale for mining?
Yeah, so that study actually stemmed from starting with my work on Isle Royale. Like I said, in 2017, I was part of the Relic Shoreline survey, which really focused on capturing the archaic lens of Isle Royale, looking for
Yes.
new sites, identifying those sites, and protecting those sites so that they can be, you know what I mean, preserved for future generations. What we came into though is we did all this work on Isle Royale and we realized we had no idea on the North Shore where sites were. At this point, we hadn't reached out to really anybody up there. As far as we knew, there was like 2 publications that talked about copper archaic sites on the North Shore of Lake Superior. And for my dissertation, I needed sites on the North Shore. So I thought to myself, how can I model where to look for sites? And I came
Mm-hmm.
across this really interesting paper. Supernaut was one of the authors on that, and there's another author on that begins with a G that I apologize to for not remembering their name. But they did a really interesting study on maritime least cost path analysis over in the Pacific. Now, the thing to know about least cost path analysis is it's typically done on a terrestrial environment. Doing it on
Mm.
water is challenging. Part of
Hmm.
this is because 2 of the main things that go into least cost path is terrain cover. So is something really rocky? Is it desert? Is it swamp? And slope, so an elevation. So is this a really, tough thing to climb up? Is it nice and flat? Can I just run across it? And essentially what you do is you create, think of like if you were to take a environment, say a mile by mile piece of environment, and you made it into a checkerboard, and each checker had a value on it. Now, if it was like really steep and hard to climb, it would have a higher value. If it was really swampy and really hard to traverse, it would have a higher value. If it was
Mm.
nice and flat, you could just run across it, it'd have a really low value. And you
Mm-hmm.
would put 2 points on it, one on one side of the checkerboard, one on the other. And you would have to draw a line across that checkerboard having the least value possible. So you want to go to the squares that have the lowest numbers. So you would avoid, for example, ones that had really high slope. Because why it may be closer, say you jump 3 tiles to get across that, well, your value's 10 on each one of those, versus if you go around by 5, it might just be 1 point on each one of those. So the
Mm-hmm.
idea being is with least cost is what is the least amount of energy I have to expend to move from one side of the board to the other in a certain environment. So again, this is done in a terrestrial environment, but what this paper did was they modeled this in a maritime environment. And what they did and what I was able to pull from them and apply it in our area was you can look at, say, water crossings instead of it just being a flat area, because in traditional least cost path, water is either really easy to cross or it's really hard to cross, depending how you're looking at it. If you can just get in a boat and go, it's pretty low cost. If it's a river you have to swim across, it may be a really high cost.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of the challenge with least cost. But what I wanted to do is apply it to, right, a maritime environment. So what I looked at things such as your exposure to the wind. So if you were, for example, going around the tip of Isle Royale and it was really, really windy, that's a high cost. Versus if you were to go through a nice protective cove, that's a low cost. So, and then also current. Is it a really strong current somewhere? If you're fighting against the current to go somewhere, that's going to be a really high cost. Distance from shore too. If you're in a canoe, you want to kind of stay close to shore if possible. There's kind of a golden range there, right? Rather than being in the middle of the lake. So if you're out in the middle of the lake, that's going to be a higher cost because it's more risky. And what I did is I pulled all these factors and I gave them each a value on a scale, right? So the farther you were from shore, the higher the cost. The more exposed you are to the wind, the higher the cost. And I applied this in about a 64-kilometer radius around Isle Royale, reaching up into the North Shore. Now, what was really fascinating about this technique is, again, traditional least cost path analysis. It starts with 2 points. You're going from point A to point B. So Macargo Cove on Isle Royale to Thunder Bay. And you would just calculate what the best way to do there. What I did instead with this was I created a matrix. So I made a circular area, 64 kilometers across, around Isle Royale, including and encompassing Thunder Bay. And I put points, I think about 16 points all around this circle. And I calculated the least cost path between every point and every other point in that circle. So, and this created a bunch of crisscrossing squiggly lines all across this map. And I looked at the density of where those lines crossed over the most. And what this created was a nice highlighted map that showed you the travel corridors. What is the best spot going to and fro? And what I ended up with was a really nice map showing if you're on Isle Royale or you're on the North Shore and you're going to travel to Isle Royale or vice versa, where is your most likely landing point and travel point to when you're going to and from Isle Royale? And the areas that lit up, not surprising at all, were the areas, at least on Isle Royale, that we saw a lot of copper working. One of the biggest ones, as you mentioned, was Macargo Cove.
Mm-hmm.
Going from the North Shore right across Isle Royale to Macargo Cove was a really good angle to shoot at if you're going from the North Shore. and then go into Macargo Cove. And
Mm,
then the same thing if you're going from, say, around the Grand Portage area, maybe a little further east of that, over towards Isle Royale and hitting the kind of that west end of Isle Royale by what is that, Washington Harbor.
yeah.
So you're seeing these travel routes. And the other thing that's interesting is as I then looked at what a lot of European explorers wrote down about traveling to Isle Royale, and then some of the accounts taken from some of the indigenous people specifically when they would travel to Isle Royale. And a lot of these travel accounts matched up with what we were seeing with this model. The indigenous people would talk about skimming along some of the islands just off Thunder Bay and then using those as a launch point to go to Isle Royale. And that's one of the things this model showed, is that kind of skimming and launching point. And again, the idea behind this was not necessarily to look within the lake where they were traveling across, but to look where were the points of termination and beginning? Where would you begin and where would you end? Because most likely
Mm,
that's where you're going to find evidence of activity, right? We could then
yeah.
go to those areas, survey those areas, and it'd be our highest likely chance of finding a site rather than just having a whole coastline and saying, maybe there's a site here.
That's such an interesting approach because for those that are not aware of Isle Royale,
Yeah,
and
Isle Royale's about 45 by 15 miles.
okay, 45 by 15. It's in Lake Superior, and it is about at the closest point, what, like 15 miles from the north shore of Lake Superior. And indigenous people, like the Anishinaabe people that live there historically, they travel to the island using canoes, mainly birch bark canoes, right? And these, it's interesting because you wonder when you look at the whole vast island. It's not like a small island. It's fairly long, 45 miles. Where do you begin to look when you're trying to find evidence for archaic people? Like, there's so many landing points, seemingly, but what Ryan is showing is that if you put all these factors into play, the routes that come out in the model are very similar to what you would think historically, and what historical evidence shows people would have, the routes they would have taken to actually get there. So that's when you see those two lines of evidence match up, historical and tradition and the model, and they're like telling you the same thing, you're on to something. Now,
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
so we are now, you're working on this Relic shoreline. So tell me, what do you mean by you worked on the Relic shoreline? You were wondering people traveling to this Relic shoreline from the northern shore of Lake Superior. What is the Relic shoreline?
Yeah, that's actually a great question and a great thing, I think, to explain here. So, Lake Superior formed about 10,000 years ago when the final glaciers kind of melted and moved north out of the area, making it ice free. And the thing to know about Lake Superior is that its water level has changed quite significantly over the past 10,000 years. The water level that we know today has really only been stable for roughly about 1,000 years. And even within that, there's variation. My in-laws owned a camp on just out of Marquette on Lake Superior, and the erosion even to their shoreline within the time that my wife was a little kid to now is really different. But with the shorelines, with those past 10,000 years, is the lake level's gone up and down, and every time it goes up and down, it creates a new kind of a normal shoreline, if you will. So the shoreline we have today is not the shoreline you would have had 4,000 years ago. And it's not the shoreline you would have had 9,000 years ago. And there's a couple different major shorelines that we track. The first one, right out of the glaciers melting, is called the Manong, in which case the water level was way up. Now, most of Isle Royale was underwater. A lot of the surrounding areas were underwater. And there's really just this kind of just spine that's sticking out of the water. Now, it was like that for a while. And we're not talking 10, 20 years. We're talking hundreds of years, sometimes thousands, that these lake levels would stay at least close. Even within that period, it would vary. But they would wash against the shore and they would create a pronounced relic beach, essentially the beach that is left behind when the lake level changes. And you can still see this on Isle Royale. After the Manong, the water drops significantly. There was an ice dam somewhere along the edge of the lake that burst, and really the water kind of just emptied out. And we call this the Houghton Low. And this would take place roughly during the early Archaic period. And what's interesting about this is that any sites that you were to then go look for during this period, this early Archaic period, if they were on the coast, if people were living on the coast, which we assume they would be to access the water, they'd all be underwater today. And we actually can't access those sites through traditional archaeological methods. You'd have to get into more of an underwater approach, which is beyond me personally. But there are definitely individuals that do an excellent job of that. And then the period that I study, though, is after the Houghton Low, the water slowly began to rise, and it went up above the water level that we know today. And this is called the Nipissing. This is about, I think, 12 meters or so up, straight up from our current water level. And this created the Nipissing Relic shoreline, right? Relic being it's no longer there, the water's dropped, but you can see the shoreline as you're walking. If you're in the Keweenaw Peninsula, you can see this. If you're up on anywhere around that kind of area of Lake Superior, Thunder Bay, it's really prevalent too. If you're in Thunder Bay City, it's very prevalent. The university kind of sits in that area if you go to Lakehead. And on Isle Royale, all across the lake, that's prevalent. And what's interesting was, so then the lake level dropped again to the Algoma, and it kind of stabilized, like I said, about 1,000 years ago to what we know today. Is the first surveys of Isle Royale really focused on the shoreline, and they found a lot of woodland sites, woodland period sites.
The modern shoreline.
The modern shoreline,
Yeah,
yes.
right.
And they theorized, Kevin Clark theorized, he thought, hey, why are we not finding archaic sites?
Yeah.
He goes, something's wrong here. And he was the one of the people that suggested, like, hey, maybe we're looking in the wrong spot. And one of the great projects that Seth De Pasquale did was modeling that shoreline. He had a bunch of people to help him with that, but I'm just going to throw Seth out for now on that one. But
yeah, there's another guy that's a major player in that we should know.
Yes.
Jeez. Breckenridge. Andy Breckenridge.
Andy Breckenridge did a lot of work with that.
He did a ton of work on that.
Yep.
He needs to get the credit, so I'll put his paper up on that.
No, definitely a good person to put on that because he's the shoreline guy, right? Seth's the archaeologist, but he is the shoreline guy.
Mm-hmm.
And
they work pretty close.
That.
Yeah, they work closely together to model that shoreline, the Nipissing shoreline across Isle Royale.
And they were then able to then go in and now various people have done different methodologies and like where are the more high probability areas. Casey Campetti did that, kind of looking at where are the best places to look, particularly in McCargo Cove. And different people have looked at it since then, and they all have done amazing work and done a really good job identifying archaic sites across Isle Royale. So we went from having very few sites to all of a sudden, wow, there's a heavy archaic presence on Isle Royale that we can see. And this is kind of where I entered the story. I kind of entered in again they started this about 2012. I started on Isle Royale about 2017. And as we came in, the question that was proposed to me, especially as somebody considering doing research in this area, was, well, where are people going once they're on Isle Royale, right? We have this data. We know that people are here. But then what? Are they going to the North Shore? Do we see evidence of them on the North Shore? And we just didn't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much unknown about the archaic presence on Isle Royale. There are no settlements, as far as I know or am aware, on Isle Royale that can be attributed to archaic society or archaic people. No burials have ever been found. Very little overall lithic and I would say copper evidence for archaic people. It's there, but
before 2012, yeah.
Yeah, before 2012. But really the biggest evidence on the island are these huge pits in the rock and tons and tons of hammerstones that are found above the Nipissing shoreline, which I think is a crucial piece of observation, let's say. And these huge pits, especially, we're not going to talk about specifics of all the locations of them, but the one that's really known in the public is McCargo Cove.
Yeah.
They indicate there must have been a lot of people there to me, at least seasonally, and the amount of evidence that is found is, I feel like is pretty sparse. And so, yeah, like where they went after, like you said, there's very little information on that. They must have been connected to the North Shore of Lake Superior culturally because of the stone technologies found between the two sites.
That's a good thing to talk about, I think, for a second there, Dave, is so when they started finding these archaic sites, they started finding lithics on them that matched sources on the North Shore of Lake Superior, specifically Jasper taconite and Hudson Bay lowland chert. And we're seeing these lithics. So, you may debate, well, where are the people coming from in the archaic? Well, the lithics are indicating that they're coming from the North Shore. And that's
Yeah,
what really
for the,
kicked off that conversation of, well, then what are we seeing on the North Shore to go along with this?
okay, okay. Yes, so there's definitely evidence that the people came from the North Shore based on the lithics. It's what is sparse to me is habitation sites, burial sites. I think any other basically any evidence outside the mining on Isle Royale seems to be sparse, right?
Before the Relic Shoreline survey, I would say yes.
Yeah, before.
But
Okay.
before that, yeah, and we have these mines, and we know these mines are old. You mentioned McCargo Cove. The Manong mine is just up from McCargo Cove,
Hmm.
and we really don't even know the extent of the size of the Manong mine. I believe the last study the Park Service did, not to quote myself on this, but I think they identified what, a couple hundred or a couple
Yeah.
thousand mines only. Other estimates have had really, really big numbers, but nobody actually went and counted. The thing to keep in mind with the Manong mine is that it was also a very large historic copper mine by Euro-Americans, and they
Mm,
essentially put their mining operation right on top of the Indigenous operation. So
right.
anything that would have been there, and probably some of the largest copper deposits, are all, it's gone because the
Yeah,
landscape was
right.
completely destroyed by the Euro-American miners.
That's a good point to bring up. Almost all these pre-contact mines have been totally destroyed, so we have very
Yes.
little information on scientific information about their size and extent. And there's a lot of undocumented digging and pecking. I'm sure that went on.
A lot of prospects. And this is a
Yeah, a lot
global
of prospect.
problem with
Yeah.
studying ancient metallurgy. I mean, this isn't just to the Keweenaw Peninsula or Isle Royale. I mean, Cyprus is a good example, right? People have been mining copper on Cyprus for thousands of years, but the archaeological evidence, because there's still active mining going on Cyprus, they just keep digging on top of each other. So it's really
Hmm.
hard to study ancient mining as a result of that, just because, my technology limits me to this, and then the next guy may have better technology and he digs a little deeper and a little deeper and deeper, and then there's really nothing to study oftentimes, which is part of what makes Isle Royale unique, being a national park. No
Hmm.
new mining operations are going to go in on Isle Royale. Nothing is going to, destroy that any further. Even the historic mines that I mentioned, those are preserved too. So people are, one day are really interested in what's going on in the 1800s, 1900s, and copper working. They can go study that because it's not going to have another mine put on top of it.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, and there's degrees of preservation too across the island. Minong happened to be one of the biggest mines historically in the 1870s.
Yes.
And there are just several historic accounts that at least note that they think there were pretty fairly large remains. I've been to McCargo Cove once, at least once, maybe twice, and walked that ridge. And I know what you mean by the pits are almost continuous. Like you're in one and you're out the other one. I know you've been to Isle Royale and you've seen some of these too. And sometimes it's hard to know where they start and end. And but when you're on that ridge and you step and you look near where the tree line ends, where it's kind of rocky and everything, you can just see it's peckings as far as the eye can see. And you're
But
just
yeah.
like, I don't even. First of all, you just like you're like scratching your head. You're like, and then there's really not much you can do besides observe it and wonder about the extent of what's underneath there too, because a lot of them are covered with huge amounts of soil or thick soil layers, wood and everything like that.
Well, and something to keep in mind too is as they would mine, they were essentially mining next to other pits. And where would your back
Yeah.
dirt go? It'd go into the pit next to you.
Yes.
And we
Right.
see a lot of that, So when mines have been excavated, even when we're dating them, we can date mining, but we can't necessarily date that specific pit because it might just be from the pit next to it, because that's where the backfill is going.
Exactly. Exactly. The pit mine dates. I've
They're
had
a
issues
headache.
with those. They're a headache, and we can maybe get into that a little bit later. I do want to, before we move on, I want to also bring up, it's very interesting the correspondence between finding a lot of archaic material at the Nipissing shoreline and the evidence we find in the lake sediment records. Because I published the first evidence from the Keweenaw in 2013. And I think I'd been talking with Seth since about 2010. Seth De Pasquale, as we mentioned, he's the cultural resource manager at Isle Royale. So we in 2013 we published the evidence that we can find this archaic pollution. And I wonder how much that went into influencing Seth's decision to look at the archaic shoreline, and or if it was just like same idea happening at the same time with Clark. Um, but what they found, you know, the reason I bring this up is because I came up there, I think a summer like in 2015 or 2016, and Seth came running up to the Keweenaw Brewing Company. We were meeting there. And Seth came running up and he's like, we did a our a survey on the Nipissing shoreline and Macargo Cove, and there's stuff everywhere. He could barely get it out of his mouth. And it was when I was still like just starting to publish the lake sediment research, showing the timing, at least from what my data shows, the lead pollution is detectable before about 5,000 years ago till about 9,500 years ago across the Keweenaw and Isle Royale. That's consistent with finding evidence on the Nipissing shoreline and the absence of evidence on the woodland shoreline for metalworking to some degree, I guess. Seth would probably debate that.
I mean, there still is copper in the woodland sites.
Right. Yeah. Because that's the thing. I don't disagree that copper was used up until contact. There is literally written evidence of that. And I just think the degree and scale of extracting copper from the bedrock in certain areas, or the industry, the copper industry, as you bring up in your paper, varied through time. That's what I think the key part of that research showed was in the lake sediments, is that if emissions are proportional to industrial activity, which historically that is pretty much the case, then that same assumption goes in the past. And when we see increases in anthropogenic metals deposited in regional lakes around mines, do we assume that the industry must have grown more intense around those areas and left that signal? So I definitely can, in my mind, I think we can put together both the historical contact use of copper and the varying degree of the industry, because there's no doubt copper was used all through the woodland and revered by the people living there at the time. So yeah, no doubt on. You're not going to get any argument from me there. And I don't think you were. I just want to clarify that because those are things I've talked about with some people too. Anyway, okay. Now you bring up the industry. So this is a big part of your paper. Is it the chapter or your 2023 article where you make the case that you think the copper mining on Isle Royale should be viewed as more of an industry rather than a term like gathering? Can you clarify why you think that is?
Yeah,
What
so this
paper
was
was that?
I did talk about it in my dissertation, and it's more subtly, I think, woven into some of my papers. I'm not sure how direct it is in all of them. I know in my newer one, I definitely bring it up briefly, my newer paper.
Yeah, I
But
saw somewhere where you're saying it should be termed an industry, and I wrote it down. Now I don't know where I put it, but anyway, go
it's
ahead.
it's in some of the papers more subtly somewhere. It's definitely explicit in my dissertation. That's where my mind went to when you mentioned that. I'm sure I wove it into other things as well. But it really comes down to, how do you define an industry? What is an industry? And a lot of the traditional definitions with dealing with an industry really just focus on the Industrial Revolution. Well,
Right.
it's an industry if it has to do with the Industrial Revolution. Well, it's like, well, that's not really the strongest way to define that, if you could. And different people have talked about this, different industrial archaeologists, and it almost becomes this creeping problem as they try to define an industry. Even the Industrial Revolution, well, where does it begin? Well, it
You're right.
begins around this time. Well, the events leading up to it are important too, so that's also industry. Well, if we're looking at those events, you can keep pushing that definition back if you were to say only focus on the Industrial Revolution. But if you were to focus on the activities more, looking at these people that are doing essentially the same type of activities across an area, across a region, across a temporal period, right? Looking at that concept that this is an industry. You know what I mean? You think of modern industries today and how they work. Well, they're industries because you have somebody producing something, like I said, on a scale that's sizable. But again, how do you define that scale? And I think it's really, it can be a loose definition of, what's going on. And it really comes down to production too. You are producing something and you're doing it at an intensive scale, you know. And so then conceptualizing things as an industry isn't something that's limited to, say, the historic period to the Industrial Revolution, but this is something that you can see in all different periods of human activity, right? We can see it, if we talk about, jumping back over to, say, England, we talk about the industries surrounding flint and the flint napping industries and the flint making industries, not just, for they used a lot of this for making flintlocks, but they also used a lot of this back into the Neolithic, looking at these large flint mines. And the same thing here in the Great Lakes on Isle Royale, right? We have an industry going on here. We have people producing copper at a very large scale over a long temporal period. They are producing the copper, right? They're not just gathering it, they're not just picking it up, but it is an intensive activity.
Right. The one issue, bringing up the Industrial Revolution, how do you define that? My definition is the fossil fuel revolution is probably the better term for the what we call the Industrial Revolution. It's really the application of fossil fuels to iron and steel technology. And that's like the steam engine. If you want to, I think that's the best cutoff, because the word industry, like you're saying, is, in my mind, is turning raw resources into some sort of product for human society. And in the case of the copper industry, that could be removing native copper from the bedrock and banging it into a preform, like a square shape. Actually, I have some I have ready. Like, here's a preform of like a reproduction, and then canoeing that to the mainland, to a place where people gather to trade. And that, to me alone, that's taking raw resources to a shape and then inserting it into the economy of some society that it's valued in.
And it's an accumulative technology too, right? To look at copper, even how we use it today, you have to understand how copper became used by humans. You have to understand how we developed that technology and how it came to fruition, right? And it's all connected. You can't just, it's not in a vacuum. And it,
Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was going to say that it also speaks to another thing I think related to that with some of my work is the concept of metallurgy. A lot of people, when they're talking about metallurgy, so archaeologists who study metallurgy are called archaeometallurgists, fun term of the day. But there's this idea when I first started out, people would talk about metallurgy in the past, and they would use the term pre-metallurgy and metallurgy. And part of how they were defining metallurgy was based on the concept of smelting. So for them, a lot of people would define it as once you begin smelting, you begin true metallurgy. And that was something that didn't necessarily sit well with me, because in my mind, well, when you begin smelting, right? That's essentially what you're defining. You're defining smelting technology. So how I always looked at metallurgy, when I first started out, I would use the term pre-metallurgy because that's what everybody else used. But I really kind of stopped doing that. I shied away from it because realistically, what is metallurgy? Well, it's the use production of metals. You know, it's actually it's integrating yourself with that. You don't have to limit it by a certain technology. You don't have to say something's not metallurgy because it doesn't do this. Because all smelting really is purifying ore. And if you're using native copper, you don't need to purify ore.
That's a good point to bring up. In the copper that's found in the Isle Royale and Keweenaw, it's in the native copper form. That doesn't mean Native American copper. Just the term for metallic copper or any metals in its native form. It's just elemental form, I should say, is
Yep.
native copper. There's native silver, there's native gold, there's native copper. And
Pretty much all gold is native gold, interesting enough.
interesting.
That's why you can find it panning. It's elemental gold.
Yeah, and it's very unreactive too.
Yes, it
Unlike
doesn't
copper,
bind.
yeah, copper likes to oxidize, which helps to preserve organic matter, but it makes it a little bit, I guess, less likely to survive in small bits for a long time, I would say. So
Yeah,
on
it
the
likes to erode.
it does like likes to erode, but it can also be found like on Isle Royale, in the lower southern shore. It's found in a ridge forming rock known as the Portage Lake volcanic rock. It's found usually as veins and vesicles in that rock. These veins and vesicles are filled with native copper. When the they were originally exposed as ridges when the ice retreated following the last glacial maximum. They are really old rocks. They're like Precambrian, Proterozoic, 1.1 billion year old rocks that over the course of the Pleistocene have just been eroded and exposed. And these ridges with these veins of copper were originally encountered by Native Americans, probably following megafauna and game, following the retreat of the ice sheet, would you say?
Yeah, it's interesting. So one of the most interesting sites is so Isle Royale is in Lake Superior, and then north of that is Thunder Bay. Now Thunder Bay has a very large taconite deposit, which is a type of stone that people were used for flint knapping. People were using taconite. We have paleo sites in Thunder Bay that actually predate the copper. And I was actually
Really?
talking with a colleague of mine earlier this week, and they were excavating, and they found a layer of archaic copper, and then under that taconite with no copper in it. So we actually have people almost north of Isle Royale before, as far as we know, and we may change this at some point in the future, that people were actually going to Isle Royale for copper because the paleo peoples were in Thunder Bay and they were accessing those quarries.
Now, how do you suppose these people got this native copper out of the rock? Can you hypothesize? I know we don't really know very well, but what do you think? How did they mine back in the Archaic period?
Yeah, so I mean the absolute easiest way to mine is to look for float copper. So this is
Oh,
copper
okay.
as the glaciers came down, right? And I'll get to the actual hard rock mining, but
Yeah.
as the glaciers came down, they scraped across the beds of copper, and this is what, as Dave just mentioned, this is what actually made the copper visible on the surface. And they pushed those glacial deposits down. They kind of just deposited them wherever the glaciers stopped. There's a lot of this in Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And you can actually go out in riverbeds and in glacial deposits and find little rounded pieces of copper. And those are readily accessible throughout Wisconsin, Michigan's Upper Peninsula. A lot of people go look for them as an activity. But these nodules of copper, right, this float copper came from somewhere. And it came from primary beds of copper in Isle Royale in the Keweenaw Peninsula. And as Dave mentioned, these are coming from Portage Lake volcanic. So this is basalt. And these are copper veins, copper nodules embedded in the basalt. So, some of them are large and rounded, some of them are really thin veins. And in order to get that out of the basalt, you had to, of course, remove the basalt around it. Now, one of the biggest theories, and Susan Martin really talks about this in her book, Wonderful Power. She has a great chapter on it. And there's another researcher, Katie Trotter. She's currently researching it. She is at University of Wisconsin-Madison. But you would do a process called fire setting and quenching. And the idea being on this, once you identify a copper vein or a copper deposit you want to mine, you would start a very large fire, or at least a contained fire to the area you want to mine. You get it nice and hot. And once you let that fire burn for a couple hours, and Katie's done some work on this for, how long to let the fire actually burn to make it worth mining again, you could then quench it in cold water. And the idea behind this is the shock between the hot rocks and the cold water would actually cause them to start to become really brittle and break. So the idea isn't necessarily to just like fracture it and take out pieces, but instead is to make the rocks, the basalt, brittle. You could then take a hammerstone. So think of a large cobble of any really kind of rock that's hard and works. Granite works great. I've actually seen them made of sandstone before. That really shocked me. A large anvil, hammerstone with pieces broken off the end where they were smashing. And some people debate if these were hafted. Some people debate if these were held in hand. We're not really
Right.
sure. We do see grooving on some of
Yeah.
them,
Or there's
which would
grooving on
indicate
some
that
of
they
them.
were being hafted.
Onto
I know there's
something.
been, yeah, they're doing something with them. And there's actually been some really interesting theories of even like putting them on like strings, like really large ones, and like almost like dropping them down with a
Yeah.
counterweight. Some of my colleagues and friends have proposed that, which is interesting. But the point being is they would take these hammerstones and they would then smash up this really brittle basalt. And we'd heard theories about this for years. When a lot of the early people who discovered these copper areas, discover is not the right term, the Euro Americans who came across them, when they would excavate them out, Holmes is a good example. He was publishing in like 1901, but they would talk about charcoal in the bottom of these pits that they would dig out from the copper mines. And I was actually had the opportunity to be on one of these excavations somewhere on Isle Royale when they were excavating a mining site. And as you would pick up the basalt, this really hard basalt that's like ripping your shoes to shreds as you're hiking into the site, and you kind of toss it behind you, it'd shatter into a bunch of pieces because it was so brittle from that. And it was discolored. There was evidence of heat treating. with that. There was charcoal inside of the pit. And that's really the best theory we have for how they got that out, is they would, like I said, light the fire, quench it in cold water, break it up with a hammer stone, and then pull out the copper as they need it and, continue to refine from there.
And I know they found evidence for copper chisels. So there could have been some chiseling with copper.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so my feeling was, I know there's been some back and forth on this fire quenching the rock, because there has been some evidence that it's not that effective, because a lot of the heat is transferred up, and it would take a lot of work in a lot of these places to bring water in, and especially without, assuming no ceramics, but I'm sure there was like birch bark baskets or something you could create. Now it's still either whatever vessel you bring in, you're carrying it, is my point. And it just seems like that would be a lot of work. But then again, mining copper is a lot of work. My feeling, there was some debate that, hey, is any of this evidence at all for fires? Is it all just like forest fire debris in these pits? And I know there's been some recent excavations you've been on that they do confirm that there are charcoal found along these veins, and it does seem there is, as you say, evidence for fire use. But my feeling is, wouldn't it make more sense the fire is used to make the copper vein more malleable for extraction? So if you're actually breaking the mineral matrix around the vein, you're building the fire next to a vein of metal that's pocked with calcite and plagioclase
Yeah.
and all this stuff. We haven't done an experiment like that, right? We have not put a bonfire next to a native vein of copper exposed in a rock, right? And I think if we
So
if we do that, we'll show that actually softens the vein, and then you could thin it out and get it to the point where you can break it.
So I know of two people that have experimented on this. One of them is Tyler Bastian back in, I think, the 60s, 70s. He did work, I want to say it was on Isle Royale where he did this, but he
Yes.
went to the basalt, he started the fires. I think his conclusions were kind of like, this is inconclusive.
Yeah, I think that's what I remember from that too. Yeah.
More
Something like it.
recently, like I said, Katie Trotter's been doing research on this, and should let Katie talk more about this, but I'll briefly mention some of the stuff she's told me at least. But she's mentioned that she does think it's more efficient than Bastion let on, and that the
Really?
longer you let the fire burn, the more brittle it gets. And that by itself, I'm like, okay. But then, like I said, being on the site and seeing like the really brittle basalt and seeing that it's like almost purplish colored, for me, that was as an archaeologist, that's evidence of fire
Really?
setting. That's firecraft rock, as we would call it. That's pretty obvious. And then seeing all the charcoal inside the pit. As for forest fires, there's lots of forest fires. They burn over sites all the time. I'm sure there's been many of them on Isle Royale. I know myself, I have been on Isle Royale, and there's been fires on the
Yeah.
island. But I actually, my first year there, I got sent up to in Lane Cove. There was a campfire got out of control, and they got it down. It was right in one of the sites, so we had to go look at. So it's not that you don't see charcoal from campfires, but it is very different than being mixed in with all of the rock and the rubble and the debris down inside of these pits. It's very different. It would be a layer. We would see it in essentially discrete layers, because a fire would go through, would burn, and then as an archaeologist excavating, you could identify that.
Right. Okay, so there's solid 100% evidence, and I'm with you on they had to use fire.
As for what
evidence
you were
is
saying
clear.
about the copper, though, with annealing it, you actually just
Yeah.
made me think of something that I don't know if it's been thought of, but it sprung into my head. When you're working copper and it becomes worked too much, it becomes brittle. So as you're working copper, and it starts to break apart, it starts to fracture. So if you were in there hammering on the copper or hammering next to the copper, and you took some swings and hit that copper, if you kept doing that, the copper would eventually start to deteriorate. So as you just said, maybe it's possible that the fire was less for the rock. Maybe it is for the rock, but it's possible that not necessarily to make the copper soft to rip it out, but to keep it from getting too brittle to where it's no longer usable, possibly. And that's just me spitballing. I have no evidence for that.
Yeah, and I think that's what we really need, is that an experiment with trying to extract a native vein with the wood and the fire and everything, because right now just burning basalt rock, of course, burn it long enough, it's going to get brittle. And another thing is the matrix that's around these veins, from what I can gather looking at the rocks, like there's like these zones of crystal minerals, like white crystals next to the vein, usually like a plagioclase or and then it kind of fades into regular bedrock. So the vein is sort of native copper embedded within carbonate, calcite, white minerals and green minerals, and you've seen them too. So maybe those minerals, they're, especially if they're carbonates, they would be very susceptible to heating and breaking down. They're a lot less tough than, let's say, like a quartz. Quartz is really, you could burn quartz all day. It's a pretty robust mineral, and a lot of
Silica,
the
yeah.
yeah, it's a silica mineral. A lot of the basalt minerals too, they're going to be very resistant to just straight up heating. But right along the vein, there could have been some anomalous type of composition that would have been better. We can only speculate because these veins, what they were pecked over
They were
by,
mined, yeah.
yeah, they were all mined. If they weren't
The
hit
easy
by
ones were
the
mined.
archaic people, they were targeted by the historic people, and the historical miners completely obliterated the evidence and ripped up everything the old people had done. So we don't really have good examples of here's what they had seen. These veins would have probably been sheets exposed. I've seen pictures underwater of some of these veins that are still found in Lake Superior, and they would have probably been sticking out of the ground. And they're more resistant than the bedrock to erosion. So as the glacier retreated, these veins would have been kind of propped out of the surface and easy to identify, at least at first. But clearly they were, in some places, dug even below the surface. There's evidence that archaic people dug pits like 20, 40, 50 feet. And
Oh yeah, and they were using logs to almost wedge the copper up.
they were using, and they had ladders with tree branches that they'd found, things like that. So the archaic people, when they were first kind of came into the area, and the people that first encountered the copper, they probably would have seen veins sticking out of the ground, is what I'm thinking. And
yeah.
And those are long gone, so it's hard to replicate exactly what had happened by applying what we know, because the sites that would have been perfect to study are gone. They're long gone. And I think the fact that copper was exploited so extensively across the Keweenaw and Isle Royale, I mean, I think it's fair to say that every known exposure of copper above the Nipissing shoreline, I will preface it with that, there's evidence for indigenous copper working.
The ones that we found anyways.
I guess, yeah. I
Yeah.
guess if we haven't found them, we don't know. Because I'll say there are some, Beaver Island right along the shoreline, I think or Washington Island on Isle Royale does have a vein that's preserved.
Yeah, I know there's a couple right on the shorelines you can go and see, but like you said, those would be during the Nipissing, potentially underwater. And with the earliest sites too, I mentioned this earlier with the Houghton Low, anybody on the coast during the earliest sites would be underwater right now. So then the only evidence we'd probably be looking would be mining sites. And if people are mining on top of each other,
yeah,
it's going to be hard to distinguish that, right?
Now, one question people have had in the literature over the years is finding a geochemical fingerprint of the copper so that we can fingerprint where the exact mines where the copper we find in archaeological sites south of the lake and north lake, where did they actually get this copper from? And there have been approaches over the years looking at different trace elements within the copper. But you took a new approach, lead stable isotopes, which I think is a very good approach to looking for sourcing, because lead stable isotopes are stable. Even they don't fractionate when heated, correct me if I'm wrong. And these artifacts were heated. And we look at ratios of 208 and 206 of lead, stable isotopes of lead. So I should clarify that for the listener. When we're saying isotopes, what we're referring to is when we look at a nucleus of an atom, you can vary the amount of neutrons in the nucleus of an atom, and it'll still be the same element. It'll still behave chemically like, let's say, lead. You could take lead 206, which the 206 is referring to the size of the nucleus, and you can pop on 2 more neutrons, and it would be lead 208. And it's still lead chemically, but it has slightly a different atomic mass. And that gives it, in the ratios of the stable isotopes of lead, there's a few, 207 being another one. The ratios of those isotopes are very sensitive to the geologic place where they had formed. So if they're forming in rocks from the Cambrian or rocks from the recently or volcanic processes, they're going to record a distinct isotopic signature. You would think, Ryan, here, you analyze lead isotopes in copper samples from Lake Superior area, both knowing where the copper came from, the exact mine and artifacts, right? Can you
No
tell
artifacts,
us?
no.
No artifacts. Can you tell us what you did in your study and fill us in on what you found with that lead isotope study?
Yeah, just to preface that with a little background into sourcing. So, two major studies have been done on sourcing copper in the Great Lakes before I did my work. There's been some smaller ones too, not to discredit any of those people, but George Riprap did a
Yep.
major study. He was the first one. He used neutron activation analysis. And then Mark Hill was the second one more recently, and he used laser ablation, ICP-MS, inductively coupled mass spectrometer. And essentially what they did is they looked at the trace elements. So copper, say, is 99.9% pure, but what about that 0.01%? It's other elements in it. And they took that and they were able to look at what those other elements are, how they vary in amount, and then use that variation in the amount of those elements to source copper and say where it's coming from. Of course, the biggest one being Mark Hill looked at a bunch of artifacts from around the Great Lakes. He also did a bunch of work down in, say, Poverty Point in different areas outside of the Great Lakes, trying to look at, is copper coming from Lake Superior? Is copper coming from, say, up in Canada, kind of the Atlantics? Is it coming from down in the Appalachian Mountains? And looking at the overall trade of copper. Now, there are some things that come up with trace element analysis that you don't have to deal with lead. The biggest one is the statistics and the math involved in trace elements. It's really dependent on your sample. It's really dependent on the data you feed into it. And then you have to run it through a statistical program or equation in order to get the results. And if one thing changes in there, it changes your results. And that's not necessarily to say it doesn't work. It does. They've done really good work. But the beauty of lead isotopes is that you're using a ratio of two isotopes. And those don't change. That ratio is the same no matter how many things you add into the graphing of it, looking at the actual isotopes themselves. And that's the beauty of it. It's not, bound by your statistical analysis of it per se. It's you can take those isotopes right off the machine and you can graph them. And you can
Mm.
see if your stuff is next to each other. Now you can analyze that, yes, statistically and look at how they group and so on and so forth. But the thing with lead isotopes, it had never really been done. It had never been done in the Great Lakes. There's only one study that looked at copper, and specifically with copper, I should mention that, specifically with native copper. There have been isotope studies done in some of the bedrock, and actually I do talk about that in my article I have in Archaeometry, talking about lead isotopes in Lake Superior. But the only study that's been done on native copper in North America was done by Corey Cooper and his colleagues, and that was done up in the Arctic. And Corey, I think, had 2 or 3 samples from Michigan. And I actually asked, hey, do you know where in Michigan these came from? He says, not a clue. They're from the Michigan somewhere in there. But he's studying, right? He's got really good data up in the Arctic, but the Michigan ones were more just a side comparison. And I noticed when he did his that the isotopes for Michigan graphed on opposite sides of his graph. I was like, that's telling. Why is that? So I decided, so when I was looking at my dissertation, what I initially wanted to do, and what I did do somewhat, is I wanted to study copper production. But what I wanted to be able to do is I wanted to look at copper production at sites on Isle Royale, at sites on Lake Superior's North Shore, and I wanted to see if it was possible to tell if these individual production sites were getting copper from the same mines or not. Essentially, if they were all, say, getting copper from similar mines and similar sources, maybe this is, say, the same group of people at these different locations. Or are they so different, they're so discrete, and they're all going to their own mines that you can then say, no, these are different groups of people, right? That was my initial theory. That's what I wanted to do. In order to do this, I needed to use sourcing. So initially, I debated, using the trace element analysis, but there's, some overlap and some problems with that. And I thought to myself, and I talked to different geochemists and different people about this, and they said, you should do lead isotopes. And I said, okay, I'm going to try to do lead isotopes.
Smart.
So I started collecting copper samples. This was great. I actually went out in the Keweenaw with my uncle, Carl Fitzpatrick. So, Uncle Carl, if you're watching this, there's a shout out to you. And a good friend of mine, Cole. Cole is a local of the Keweenaw, and he is a very knowledgeable person, Cole Stout. And they took me around, and we just went and just picked up copper samples from tailing piles and historic mines. And the idea being
Nice.
is we knew where the copper is coming from. This is pure copper. We're not relying on anybody else. And we got a bunch from all over the Keweenaw. I then turned around the Park Service and went through the proper channels submitting paperwork. And the Park Service then went to the different mines and got samples from the mines across Isle Royale and provided those to me. And in addition to that, I didn't just stop at Isle Royale and the Keweenaw. I started grabbing samples anywhere I could around the Lake Superior Basin. I got some over in Bemainsey Point, which is over on the eastern side of Lake Superior. I got some from Michipicotecan Island. Interesting enough, those samples actually come from George Rip Rapp's collection, which is held at Michigan Tech. And they were kind enough to let me do destructive sampling on their specimens, which is hard to do for museums, but they were willing to let me do it. The Seaman Mineral Museum also provided me with samples. So the director, John, I met with him and he allowed me to go through and drill some of his more abundant samples, if you will, not the really nice display pieces. And I was able to go through, and I actually, I had a drill and a drill press, and I sat for hours just drilling out those copper samples, collecting all the pieces, keeping everything separate. And I was able to run them at the Metal Isotope Lab at Indiana University with the help of Shelley Rader. And we ran a lot of copper samples and from all over the Lake Superior Basin, and then we were able to graph them. And part of the theory going into this was if we can show that these mines have discrete lead isotopes, we can then begin sourcing artifacts. And we can begin doing that experiment that I wanted to do. And when I started graphing the results of this, when we had to do it, I think about 3 batches just because of the number of samples we were running and lab procedures and all that. But when we started graphing this, we noticed that they all started overlapping a lot. And the samples from across essentially the Lake Superior Basin really were all kind of jumbled together. And there really wasn't necessarily like you couldn't say stuff from Isle Royale separate from the Keweenaw. Nope, they all overlapped. This mine on Isle Royale is separate from this mine. The only pattern that we noted, and they were all pretty tight though, that which is significant. And I could talk about that in a second. The only pattern we noticed is as you moved from the top of the Keweenaw to the bottom, there was a slight shift in where the isotopes would graph. And that was mirrored on Isle Royale. When you move from one side of Isle Royale to the other, there was a slight shift in how they graph. Now they overlapped, but that overlap shifted as you moved with the isotope. So the theory being, at least my theory being, is that the copper flows more or less happened within one large event. This was not multiple copper flows depositing over time. The rocks probably had some variation in them, and as they kind of flowed into those rocks, they picked up a little bit of that. But for the most part, if you wanted to use isotopes to say if something's from Isle Royale or the Keweenaw, or from Manong mine versus another mine on Isle Royale, you're not going to be able to do that, at least at that fine tooth of a thing. But that's what I wanted to know. I wanted to know, can we do this? Is this possible? Because there's no point in my mind in going and drilling and sampling artifacts, because this is an invasive process. You do have to destroy the copper to get this done. So to go sample artifacts, if you don't know it works, it's not worth doing, right? So I wanted to see, is this worth doing? And my results were, no, it's not. I spent a lot of time and money on this, and essentially it was kind of one of those projects. I actually included this as a chapter in my dissertation, and it's probably the most disconnected chapter of my dissertation because that was supposed to be my whole dissertation. I was supposed to then turn around and sample artifacts and have this all together. And I actually found myself sitting in my advisor's office after getting the results back being like, I do not know what to do. And because that's just what I wanted to do. And then I had to shift, and that'll get us, I guess, into, we can talk about that in a bit, my next chapter. But I hit that point of like, oh man, that this was meant to be my dissertation.
Man, and it's such a good idea. And when I heard it, I thought I saw the work and I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be something. And then I saw what you saw and it was like, wow, you really can't discern any kind of sourcing. But, it ties in a little bit and supports my lake sediment work. Have you seen the lead isotopes? They're only in my dissertation. I did lead isotope analysis of the sediment core from Copper Falls Lake. I did some before, during the lead spike in the middle Archaic, and then after, and then historically huge change in lead isotope source, like, as you would think, and it tracks the signature leaded gas. But in the Archaic, no significant change. There's an increase in lead concentration in the lake. And if you ratio it to lithogenic metals like titanium, it's still relative to lithogenic metals, but the isotopic composition is the same as the background. And I write in the dissertation, I just say the same thing kind of you said, is that the lead isotopes, if they're from the Keweenaw, if the lead is being derived from being volatilized off the vein, the lakes are on the same bedrock. It's getting the same lead. And so therefore, you're not bringing lead from a new outside region into the Keweenaw, even in the Archaic period. Therefore, there's not going to be a significant change because it doesn't fractionate when heated. If it fractionated when heated and we didn't see a signature in the lead, then I would say, oh man, this is really something that should be there. But originally we thought that would be the case, that we would find like lead in the lake naturally would have a different isotopic signature
Right.
than these like Archaic anomaly peaks. And
Now,
no, but
one
we
thing
only did one site, and it was very limited sample size. I never did any on Isle Royale. Didn't go anywhere after those initial data because we were the same thing. It was like,
and
where
I
do we go with
imagine it'd be
this?
the same on, I can tell you it'd probably be the same on Isle Royale from my
Yeah,
results.
and that's
One thing I
probably
did note though is I mentioned Corey Cooper's study in the Arctic. I graphed his compared to mine, and why there was an overlap in the center, they almost made like a cross shaped. So there was a difference between the samples we're getting from Isle Royale and those from the Arctic. So what that told me is, if anybody out there is ever interested in doing copper lead isotopes, looking at it on more of a regional population scale, so comparing say Lake Superior to the Arctic to the Appalachians, I think that would be a study worth doing. If
that's a
anybody's out
good.
there trying to think of something, it would be worth doing from around North America. Now I know over in say the Mediterranean, they have a lot of problem with overlap there, and it's hard to do lead isotopes over there. And that was part of why nobody done it in North America yet, besides Corey up in the Arctic. But if anybody's considering it, I think that's worth doing.
And that brings up a good point. Lake Superior copper isn't the only source of native copper in North America, or Eastern North America, let's say. It is found in the Appalachians. It seems like during woodland times, Mississippian times, other sites, sources in the U.S. were utilized, and they probably do have a distinct lead isotope signature
Yeah.
that could potentially be used to be like, hey, is this an Appalachian source of copper versus a Lake Superior source or something like that?
Yeah, because a big part of it comes down to how did the deposits formed. As I know with the Arctic sources, some of them were the same age as the ones in Lake Superior, but a lot of them were different age. And that's what I think what set them apart there and separated that out.
Okay. Now, so how many field seasons did you spend on Isle Royale?
I want to say 3.
Very nice. So I'm glad that you've been out there, because I've heard through the grapevine that some people that have been prominent old copper culture publishing people, won't name names, have not even been to the Michigan copper districts, and let alone Isle
I know
Royale.
who you're talking about. We'll leave them anonymous.
So I do like when I talk to somebody that's been there, because it is such a unique experience. I mean, to see them, and I know where you've worked, and we're not going to talk about like all the specific localities because a lot of them are sensitive.
Oh, yeah.
And we're trying to preserve the oldest copper industry remains in maybe the world. It's nice having you there, and you've experienced the bugs and the moose. And I know the one summer you were out there, I had showed up just after you had left, and for some reason showed up as the bugs had just declined, because Seth was like, when Ryan and Katie Trotter were here, it was gnarly, and we
It
were
was
just
bad.
gonna.
No exposed skin. I mean, gloves, hat, bug net. You couldn't do anything. Every single part of you had to be covered, or you were gonna be they were
Yeah,
gonna fly you off.
I tell people that go out there, I'm like, you definitely want a bug net, because if you don't need it, it's fine to carry a bug
It's
net
light
around. It's light. If you need a bug net, you'll be so happy you have a bug net.
that you have one. Yeah.
You will be so happy, because otherwise fieldwork out there, backcountry stuff can be tough. The bugs can really drive you nuts.
It's brutal and it's remote. It really gives you a feel for being out there, going to Isle Royale,
Mm-hmm.
being on the lake, being on a boat, being in the, up on the ridges and the low spots and hiking Isle Royale. It gives you a really good idea. And I would say the same thing for working copper, right? If you're going to
Mm-hmm.
study copper working, you got to go to the places, but you also have to work copper. You got to have the fire going. You have to hammer it. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
have a fire pit in my yard and anvils and all the tools. I mean, the other day I was sitting there working on this. It's a little copper cell. That was just in my spare
Nice.
time for fun because I think it's important. So I do have some publications looking at experimental copper working a
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
little
let's
bit
talk about
older.
that.
Yeah, and a big part of that was I did not start publishing anything on copper working until I'd been doing it for a long
Really?
time for how young I am. I've been doing it for a couple years at that point before I even considered, hey, I should publish something on this. Now, the paper that I published on this, I wanted to see how copper generates waste.
And this is your
And yeah,
cold hammered
yes.
archaeology, an experimental archaeometallurgical approach to native copper working in the Lake Superior Basin 2023 article. I'll have a link to that in the description.
Yeah, that was published in a mid-continental journal. But the idea behind it was I wanted to study production and I wanted to see, okay, if you go to a production site, what are you going to find there? And what are you not going to find that was there at some point, right? We talked about how small pieces of copper have a tendency to corrode away.
Mm-hmm.
So what are you going to find? So what I did was I was at Indiana University, and I got connected with the metalsmithing shop there, and the folks there were absolutely phenomenal. They were so nice to me. They like helped me in any way they could. I'd actually go in and just work copper, and they'd come by, and these are expert metalsmiths, right? They're making really complex jewelry and other things and bowls, and they'd come and give me tips and advice. And they would come and talk to me like, well, how would they do this, or how would you do this? And I learned, just working with metalsmiths that aren't necessarily archaeologists. And it's like, oh, for example, they use a lot of organic like tree trunks and forms when they're hammering copper. Everybody thinks of all the hard stone
Mm-hmm.
anvil stones, but they would actually have like say a bowled out just like tree, like literally full tree trunks cut off in their hammering room, and they'd use various shapes that they put into those or carved into those to work copper, and it
Mm.
worked great. But what I did there, they gave me some workshop space for this. I went and I took, I think, about 10 pieces of copper and I put down plastic sheeting everywhere. And it didn't really matter what I made, but I was whatever the size, whatever the copper would let me do. You kind of got to listen to the copper as you're working it. It really is a skill, as I know Larry Furrow can attest. And I worked all these pieces to completion. So I either made a finished product, or they broke halfway through. And during that process, I photographed all the pieces as I went, but I also collected all the little scrap pieces that came off, even if it's just the smallest little piece that's coming off. And I collected all this through every stage of it, through every piece. So then I could then go and I went back to I had a facility at the IUMA at the time. I was able to access their analysis lab at Indiana University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Little shout out to them. And I was able to go and analyze all these little copper pieces. And I mean little copper pieces, and as well as the big copper pieces there. And I kind of looked at, what waste is produced. And I'd say that the two most significant things is a lot of these little copper pieces that break off, you can tell they were worked. They have very tall tale signs that they were ripped off, they were scraped off, something happened as you're working the copper. And it's obvious. These aren't just little pieces of natural copper. Another thing I identified is as you're working copper, you create essentially a copper dust.
Right.
And
I've heard about this.
this gets all over you. And I mean,
Right.
I still have t-shirts from when I was doing that, and they're just regular, cotton t-shirts, and they are like copper scarred on the side of them because I decided to wear them one day. That will not wash out. And we're like years later, I still wear them as my kind of work around the yard shirts, and they're still stained with that copper. And so it's going off into the soil, right? So speaking
Right.
to your work with
Yes.
something like that, I mean, this is running off into the soil. This is running off into the water. If
And the
you're
smoke
producing
clouds.
copper,
Yeah.
if you're producing copper at a scale, and this is all coming off as you're hammering it. So it's possible that you would see this either in, say, a sediment core, you'd see this even possibly in the soil, and you're going to see all these little copper pieces. Now, the reason I did this, because I was on a site, we were excavating on Isle Royale, and it was a copper production site, and somebody called me over. They're like, hey, we found something we want you to come look at. And I walk up, and there's all these little teeny copper flecks in the soil as they were, very carefully excavating. And they're like, you know what that is? And I'm like, I know exactly what that is. That is a copper production area. Somebody was working copper there. These little pieces of copper came off as they were working it. They fell on the ground right there. And that's
That's
what
what
you
they look
found.
like. Yeah.
That's what they look like. Yeah. There's just these little, like, almost like scale pieces. Because when you work copper, you're deforming it because you're not heating it up to the point where it melts together, right? You're just heating it enough to make it soft again.
And this is
And
called cold hammering.
this is called cold hammering.
Can you explain and
Yeah.
define annealing for people out there?
Yeah, so the best way to think about metals, copper specifically, because other metals get complex in their own ways, specifically iron, but think about metals as crystals. They are essentially have a crystalline structure on the inside. Now, if you were to start hammering on a piece of copper, you're essentially breaking these crystals down. And as you continue to hammer and continue to deform a piece of copper, the crystals get smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually they'll start to actually break apart. And if you keep hammering and keep hammering, the copper is going to get harder and it's going to get more brittle. And it's eventually going to actually start to fracture and kind of like splay apart. And actually, Dave, you showed a piece there that kind of had a piece that was starting to splay apart earlier.
Exactly. I know.
Sitting there.
So
and that's what's going to happen.
Here's a copper that's beaten into a preform, and it does show that bit splayed off. I wish I had...
and sometimes it's from a gap or a cavity in the copper that didn't quite work, but that's what could happen. Now, the best way to treat this is to take the copper and to heat it up. Usually you're going to aim for about, 700 degrees. You can probably get it as long as 200 degrees. And the idea being is you put it in the fire and you get it to glow orange and you leave it in there for a length of time. And what you're actually doing is you're regrowing those crystals in the copper. So instead of them being itty bitty little broken pieces, they'll actually grow. And this makes your copper soft, it makes it malleable, and allows you to keep hammering, and it keeps it from fracturing. Now, when you're working copper, you would do this repeatedly. It's a cycle. Every time the copper starts to get a little too close to being hard worked is what we call it, and this is the point it'll start to fracture, you put it in the fire and anneal it. You could do this as little as one time in a copper session. If you got a small piece of copper and you're making something simple, you can do this 20, 30, 40, 50 times. I've done it up to 50 times on a single more complex piece.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Waikiki Beach. I want to take a moment to ask you to please like this video or subscribe to my channel to support science communication. Thank you so much. Check out the beach.
And you're constantly cycling it through. And the idea behind this is you let it grow, you pull it out and you let it cool, and then you can pick it up and you can hammer it and you can modify it. That's not to say people didn't work copper hot. This is a debate in the archaeological community. Was copper only worked cold at room temperature, or was it also hot work?
Mm-hmm.
I have a theory on this that I'm going to keep to myself, but I will say I have an idea looking at some of the hammer stones where if we look at the hammer stones, we may, not the hammer stones, the anvil stones, we may be able to identify hot versus cold working based on some of those properties, but that's to come.
To come. Is that a project that you may publish, is what you're saying? Or you're working on something like that?
That's a project I'm working. I was actually, to be honest with you, I was going to work on it last night, and it was about 90 degrees in Wisconsin, and I decided not to. It's Friday night, it was hot, and I stayed in my air-conditioned house instead. So, once the temperature cools, I'll begin working on that. But okay, I'll share my basic principle of it. I was working copper one day in my workshop, and I decided to do some hot working. And I heated up my copper, and I use all naturally collected tools, right? So I'm using an anvil stone, I'm using hammer stones. I'm not using modern tools for any of this. And I start hot working the copper, and I'm doing this for a bit. Maybe I'm doing it for an hour or two, and my basalt anvil stone cracks in half. And I'm like, oh man, that's my favorite anvil. I'm kind of upset. And I look at it, and it looks, and where it broke, it looked just like, well, it was, but it was fire cracked rock. And this is something we see in the archaeological record. You often see it, say you have stones around a campfire. These rocks will actually break, and they're very obvious to an archaeologist that it's fire cracked, just kind of the pattern the breakage makes. And it was fire cracked rock right in my anvil stone. And I started thinking to myself, I bet you if you were extensively hot working a piece of copper on an anvil stone, you would cause the same thing. With the heat transferring into the stone, eventually you would see cracking. And the other thing I noticed is those little pieces of the stone were breaking off the top as I worked it, because it just couldn't take the heat of it. Now, it's possible maybe this has to do with where I got the stone or the type of stone. That all needs to be looked into. But my theory is, another experimental theory is hot working on some stones and then cold working on stones and looking at how the rock responds. Because then if you were to say go to an archaeological site and you were to look at the anvil stone and you see no evidence of heat transfer into the anvil, you can probably safely say you don't see extensive hot working at a site like that.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
that's future work.
My opinion would be that they had to firework it. I mean,
Makes it
because
more malleable.
makes it more malleable and it resets the crystallization, like you said, and
You have to anneal it. It's just a
you
matter
have
if
to
you let it
anneal it.
cool or start hammering right away.
Oh, I see it. Yeah. So whether or not you hammer it when it's hot or cold
Because you can hold it a lot
or
better
room
when it's
temperature.
cold. You can hold it when it's hot. Actually, everybody thinks when you set a hot piece down, you start hammering, it's going to go flying. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
You can set a hot piece down and hammer on it, and it will essentially stay in the center of your anvil. It's so malleable that the
Yeah.
transfer just deforms the copper and leaves it in place.
Right.
And if you need to manipulate and move it around, there's ways to do that. So it's definitely possible.
Right. I've seen, for people that haven't done this, I've seen heated copper on a rock, bashed it, and it's kind of like cold silly putty, like really cold silly putty when you deform it when it's been heated, and then as
It's so
you
malleable.
as you bash it more and more without reheating it, actually the pitch of the ting, the sound of the copper with the banging of the rock changes. Have you noticed that too, Ryan?
Oh yeah, and you touch on a really good point to make there in terms of a lot of my research and looking at how people work copper and related to it is it's really a sensory effect to work copper. You're smelling it, you're tasting it. Copper is very distinct. Think of a penny, and you're hearing it. I mean, to work copper, you're hearing the sound of it change as you work it, and as it becomes high pitched, you need to put it back in the fire, or you're going to ruin your piece.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with the color. The color changes as you heat it. It goes from, just regular copper color and it goes through a couple different color changes that always happen. And so when you're working copper, it's a sensory experience. You have to be paying attention. And then add on to that, say, working copper on Isle Royale, right? There's an extra sensory involved in that, where you are as you do it.
Yeah. Uh, I this past summer went and visited some copper mines. I went to the Adventure Mine Museum south of Houghton, and we went up and looked at all these mines up there. And when you're there, you realize there was so much you had to have known, so much culture, so much experience. You kind of call it agriculture. We say agriculture because it's a whole comes with the whole thing. This metallurgy and the old copper, like you're saying, it came with a whole sensory experience, finding the rocks, the geology, getting to the site, looking for indicator geological minerals, tracing things under the soil. And then when you're hammering it, you're even listening for the acoustics of the material, the
It's a complex
colors
industry.
that it produces when you're heating it change because of the trace elements in there. It becomes clear to you that this is not, we're overlooking some we're underestimating what's been happening. I think at least our predecessors and the general public, we are underestimating the scale of the old copper industry.
Yeah, and like I said, as we discussed earlier, it is in fact an industry. Now, in terms of global metallurgy, if you
Mm-hmm.
look at the oldest metalworking in the world right now, the oldest metalworking site we have is Keweenaw. It's in Anatolia, and it
Okay.
dates to slightly before we see copper working here. The thing is, though, if you look at that site, it's literally a couple small pieces of hammered copper. They're cold hammered. They may have been annealed. I don't know. Maybe we can tell that or not. And we don't really see a lot of intensive metalworking in the old world until about 5,000 years, 6,000 years ago. Here in North America, we see this complex issues that indigenous people were doing, this complex industry. And once it starts, it starts. Like we have yet to identify some slow crawl into, oh, this was the first crudely hammered piece of copper. No, once we start seeing copper, it's well made. It's like, as you mentioned, there's a lot of complexity into making this and to doing this and to going to these places and having this technology. And it's a very involved industry. So I don't call this the oldest metal evidence of metalworking in the world. I do call it the oldest metallurgical system because it really
Mm,
is a complex system. That's how I define it. And it's possible we're going to push those dates earlier at some point as archaeologists. It's possible we don't. But
mm.
either way, it is one on a global scale. It is one of the most significant metalworking industries, especially ancient metalworking industries in the world. And it's all the indigenous people here with the knowledge they had and the generational knowledge they had, and just phenomenal.
Yeah, and it's you find these artifacts, they're clearly utilitarian. They clearly were used for everyday life. You find them around lakes, like fish hooks and caches of fishing gear and woodworking gear and projectile points. And so this means to me that people were using metals on their, it was like on a regular daily basis. And this is, and it's way earlier than the old world where you're saying there's just a few pieces. This is like a regular part of everyday life, thousands of years before anyone else in the world is really using metals like for their day-to-day life activity. And we have almost zero awareness in the public of this, which is part of my mission to change. And I think what you're doing too is helping to change that, because it's remarkable. There's thousands of copper artifacts have been found around Lake Superior, and there's probably thousands more to be found, and not to mention lost to the bottom of Lake Superior. So this scale, and it's so extensive. I think that's when you look at the map, you realize the extensiveness of the trade, um, the and the ages of the radiocarbon dates. They span thousands of years. I mean, this was a
Yeah.
long time and geographically expansive, and it was, intricate, interconnected trade network industry tied to the copper industry. Yet when we go to Isle Royale, we hear about the Edison fishery, and we hear about the lighthouse history, or the guy that built the cabin around Howleron Lake or something. And there is like no recognition, hardly even officially. Not, I guess in some ways there wasn't much known. So we got to, I guess, be fair in that sense. But when you even go to these places today, it's like the side note that the old copper could be old there, when it's like, really, we're talking like on a world civilization, world history level type thing here. We're talking, this is big. This is up
Yeah.
there with like pyramid level.
A lot of this research it's new. It's cutting edge. It's building off of what people have done, but it's not stuff that's necessarily been out there and published and known for a long, even in the archaeological community.
Now, I think there's a lot of, I kind of want to go back to archaeology a little bit, because there's a question I think I've talked to you about, and I've definitely talked to Seth, I think as a research project. One question is how the travel routes for moving copper around. When you look at McCargo Cove and you go up into like Chicken Bone Lake and then up through there, it connects to all these series of portages that link to then like Siskiwit Lake, which comes down to the south shore of Isle Royale, and in that area. These portages, I walked a couple of them. They are serious bottlenecks, and some of them between lakes are extremely narrow corridors that I think, if I remember, you did a little bit of work running some of your model to look at these portages. But I think in terms of a hypothesis, if we're looking for people moving copper at a portage, you empty out your canoe, you move it to the next spot. This would be a spot where you would lose material, I think. Do you think that it's worth it to look at these portage sites on Isle Royale as potential areas to get at that transfer, that travel route question?
Definitely. I mean, these are definitely areas that could be targeted. They could be surveyed. Same thing up on the North Shore. I mean, we see like the Cam River running up through Thunder Bay there. I mean, there are sites all along that river as you go up that people were stopping at, that they were using. You get up into Dog Lake, and there's sites all over the place, because because where people are traveling is where they're stopping. Dog Lake was kind of a highway area, just kind of shooting off into the various waterways up into the north, and people stopped there.
And you
You're
said the
not
Cam River is Kaministiquia? Is
yeah.
that how?
I just
Okay.
can't pronounce it.
Yeah, I've seen that too. And so that was a portage, was that like a bottleneck kind of portage area river?
Yeah,
I
people were
think that,
traveling up it. I mean, there's trying to think of the person's name, but it'll come to me eventually. But there's a series of sites going up there that have been documented and surveyed, all archaic sites all
mhm.
throughout that river. I guess jumping back, not to derail your question, but jumping back to my dissertation, I mentioned that, I was trying to find sites on the North Shore. We did all these modeling. We were looking for these places. And what ended up happening was I started talking to the different collector communities up there, and I started talking to the university and the government officials. And to lo and behold, to my pleasant surprise, I was kind of gearing myself to go do that kind of surveying that you just said up on
Mm.
the North Shore. And then it kind of turned out they're like, oh, well, you don't need to do that. We have all these known sites. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, oh yeah, like, and a lot of these are private individuals that lived in the area that sometimes, it's their property, sometimes it was public property, sometimes they would go through and bulldoze areas. I know there's a famous site, the Renshaw site, that they were using. I think it was for like a gravel pit, and Dave Arthurs went and excavated that back in, I want to say, the 80s, but I may be wrong on that time period. And that's one of the more well-known sites there. But it turns out there was all these copper sites all spread, throughout this region, both on the shoreline up the Kaministiquia River, if I'm
Yeah.
saying that close, and up into Dog Lake, and then beyond. And that's where I pulled a lot of the data for my dissertation. So to look at, say, the Portages, as an area to go survey, it definitely would be worth doing. It would be time intensive to get there, though.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the stuff they do, I mean, you're able to get to on a boat, hike in a little bit, and you're there. You can start surveying. But the Portages, that would be a dedicated research trip, right? You would have to have a
Yeah.
team that could well enough of a good size to go in there, and they'd have to have time to just go to one portage, go to the other. And I think what really keeps that from being done is they're just isolated in the middle of the island. I think
Yeah.
it just
Yeah.
simply comes down to that. Yeah.
I've talked to Seth about it, and I'm like, I was there thinking about it, looking at my map and trying to picture that portage at Sisquit Lake that goes to Woods Lake, and some of them are like, if you look at the topography, I think it's just so interesting because then it's like a narrowly defined route. If you're looking at the least,
Oh
they're
yeah.
clearly not going to go up the hillside, and so it would just be like, these have got to be places that are high probability to catch any missing stuff during unpacking of a portage and what have
Yeah.
you. And
And
then
during the
you're
nipissing,
linked with somebody
yeah.
that's traveling through the island, and that links with the trade and everything.
And the nipissing too, with the water levels being higher, if I remember correctly,
Yeah.
you could go right into Sisquit Lake. You can go a lot further up into McCargo Cove than you can now. So then there's even less. Once you get to the island, right, you still have to do the portage, but that's even a more express route than we see today, because you can bring your canoe a lot further in than you can now.
I
So then you're
think
looking
even
at, yeah,
Chicken Bone was connected to McCargo,
yeah.
and
So
so
you
you
could go
could
all
take
the
that all
way
the way
in.
in. But
So
once
you're
you get
talking a
into
very,
Chicken,
select number.
right, right. Yeah, there's a very select number, and if I had the map, I could point them out. But that's why I think it's such a interesting thing that there. It's such a vast island but these portages, if you were coming from the North Shore to the south and you wanted to cut through, had to probably have hit these spots. And
And
it's
you
like,
want
man,
to cut through. If you're hitting the center of that island, it is, if you've been boating on Isle Royale, right?
oh
Going
yeah,
around
and
the
walked
tips
it.
of the island, Blake's Point there, that's a lot more risky than going down the center. Adds a lot more time.
Yeah, especially in a canoe or kayak.
Because
Yes.
Blake's Point on the far eastern side of the island there, that's choppy water. If you're
Yeah.
not there on the right day, you're exposed. It's all sheer kind of cliffs going along that north shore there. It is much more enjoyable to go in McCargo Cove, do a couple short portages, get to the south side of the island, do what you want to do, and go back.
Right. Yeah. Maybe one day I would love to be on a sabbatical and spend a summer up there and just go to portages and try to find evidence of this trading and mining, and maybe like a bag of preforms that some miner dropped or something.
Or
Heading.
purposely cached, or if you're coming back through,
True.
right?
Yeah. Or
Be for
purposely
be for
cached.
another time.
Or maybe the golden find would be an actual birch bark canoe sunk, somehow preserved, dated to the Archaic, which Seth and I joke about. I don't think it'll be found considering the conditions up there, but
I
whoa,
mean, being
that'd be
down in
crazy.
Wisconsin, they've been finding canoes in the lakes around here, but I believe they're all dugouts.
They're dugouts and they're dated to the woodland, because anytime I see anything about boats from up there, I'm downloading, finding the press release, and I look
Versus
at the,
a birch bark, that would be
yeah,
that'd be a stretch.
that'd be stretch. It's too flimsy, and Man,
But at the same time, I mean, do we fully understand when canoes switched over to birch bark? Maybe not.
I don't.
As
Yeah,
far as we
there's.
know, birch, dugouts could have been in use at that time. I don't personally know enough about that, but it's possible that they were still using more of a dugout style canoe.
I
I
bet.
don't know.
Our best hope would be that a paddle will be found at one of these mine pits as a shovel, because they found them historically, and in the paddle,
Yes.
if it looks like clearly like a kayak canoe paddle, if we could date that, then we could be like, and if that's archaic, an archaic paddle would be satisfactory. It would be adequate to not finding a boat.
But yeah, and being on an excavation at a mining site too, Seth, when you check in, would ask, "You find a paddle yet?" No.
Really, and we joke about that, about the canoe and the paddle and everything, and it's like one day maybe, because it is such a, it's a weird thing, talking to Seth as well, even at the mines that you guys have worked at, you're not finding many finished artifacts. I think he mentioned
Almost no copper. Almost
almost
none.
no copper. You're
It's all
literally
just
standing,
rock and debris. They're taking it all.
they're
They're
taking it.
out of
Yeah, it's
there.
clearly gone,
They're
taken
good at
out.
that.
Yeah, that's just so, I mean, it makes sense, I guess. It's not, I guess, in a way mysterious, but to me, I just leave so many questions. You see these vast pits, like we talked about at the beginning of the conversation. The biggest, the evidence for humans on Isle Royale, 99% of it is these gigantic pits of rock in the bedrock and hammerstones, and they're flakes of rock that they've crushed out of. Everything else, there's little bits of this found here or there. On the Nipissing shoreline, we find a hammerstone, a little bit of copper, conical point here or there lost. But there's no like, oh, here's a habitation site, here's the longhouse, here's a canoe or anything like, and all the finished artifacts would be gone, because that's the subject. You're out there to get the copper. You're not going to leave it there.
So
But
speaking of
yeah,
that too, so I have another paper. It's not out yet. It's coming out in American Antiquity at some point, and however long it takes them. But it's been accepted. But it's really what ended up being the core of my dissertation, is what it is. And I
nice.
did something called hotspot analysis. So when I abandoned the elemental tracing, I was trying to figure out what to do, and I actually sat down with a professor at the university who specialized in, funny enough, hydrology, and she's a GIS expert. And she goes, "Have you ever considered hotspot analysis?" And I go, "No, please tell me more. I know nothing about this." And the idea behind it is you put data in at certain points on the landscape, and you run it through the program, and it tells you if a spot is either hot, cold, or kind of neutral. So if a spot is hot, it means that that location and the surrounding locations have a really high value. If it's cold, this is the reverse, right? That location, the surrounding areas have a really low value, and then the neutral ones are kind of like it's more evenly scattered. So what I decided to look at is so I'm looking at copper production, and I went and I looked at about, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but about 300 sites, both on Isle Royale and Lake Superior's North Shore, all archaic copper production sites. And I broke the copper down into stages of production. So I put about 5 stages of production, with kind of a 0 stage being unworked copper. And at each site that I had access to, I was able to go and actually count all of this and go through and analyze all this copper, classify everything at each site, and put this into my model and run it. And what this model ended up showing, as you basically just hit on the head right there, is your unworked, your unfinished copper, your early stage coppers on Isle Royale. There's almost nothing taking place on the interior. As you move into kind of your middle stages of copper production, you kind of see things to be a little more scattered. There's some kind of hotspots going on kind of specifically the shoreline, Lake Superior shoreline, not
Yeah.
up in the interior yet, not on the island, but kind of more even. Once you start getting to the end of production stages, stage 4, particularly stage 5, huge hotspots up in the interior, a lot of stuff up in, say, Dog Lake area, some on the shoreline, and Isle Royale is all cold spots. There is, statistically, compared to the different copper being found, there's very few kind of the finished things being found on Isle Royale. And it's really this like almost like a rolling shift from, you see the copper begin its production, hotspots on Isle Royale, and by the time you get to the end, it's all off Isle Royale. A lot of these finished items, we're finding a lot of this finished copper. And that really ended up kind of being like the core of my dissertation there. Like I said, that paper's not out yet, but it's in press, I
Wow.
think, as they say. But and the maps for that were really showing and really telling. And like I'd never actually, I couldn't find anybody else who would use this in an archaeological site, this kind of methodology. And if somebody out there has, please let me know. I'd love to know about it. But it really allowed me to analyze the production sequence without having to use the chemical analysis and connect all these sites together essentially. And I was really kind of blown away by the results of it.
Wow. I mean, statistically show this,
Hmm.
this different stage. Wow. I mean, that's so. Why do you suppose these archaic people needed copper? Why did they have such a desire to go and obtain it from Isle Royale?
So yeah, that's a great question. And this again gets back to the core of what I was trying to figure out in my dissertation of when you're producing copper, you're not just making an item to be used, right? The goal of this isn't just I want an item that can cut, so I'm going to go get an item that can cut. But instead, as people are going and getting copper, it is essentially a sensory experience. It is a connection that they're forming both with themselves, with the landscape, and with the items, the things that are in the landscape, specifically copper in this case. So when you're going up to Isle Royale, you have to enter this island landscape, right? You have to go out there. You canoe out there. It's about an 8-hour canoe ride from the North Shore.
At the
Contemporary
shortest distance.
the shortest distance. The
Yeah.
contemporary Indigenous groups say they'd actually leave on a calm day before it even got light out, and they start canoeing. You'd get out there. You'd have to hike up into this area. You'd have to mine the copper, however intensive that is. If you're fire setting and quenching, or you're getting that copper out, you're then taking it down to your production site on the shoreline probably. While you're doing all this, you're fishing, you're mapling, you're doing all these other resource gathering activities. You're working the copper. Part of my theory is that they would then take the copper, they'd work it into a form that was transportable. I think you mentioned that earlier, right? Put it in their canoe and they'd leave. And my theory is then they would take the copper away from Isle Royale because whatever connection they had to Isle Royale, whatever connection they had to all of this, they didn't want to do the copper working there. Because you could, if you're sitting on Isle Royale waiting for the weather to get better, you could just work the copper in one go. In fact, that's what I do. When I work copper, I work it all in one go. But people weren't doing that though. They were purposefully doing these stages at different points they were moving away from Isle Royale by the time they're working copper. Now it's possible this could be trade, but I think it's deeper than that. I think what we're seeing here is that people are working copper because of the connection they have with copper and the connection they have with the landscape. If we look at one of the things I discussed in my dissertation is looking at the different more contemporary indigenous peoples, particularly the North Shore Ojibwe. Cochrane did a really good. He's got a couple of publications out there looking at some of their beliefs. Also looking at, say, Basil has a really good book called Manitous, which talks about some of the beliefs that are connected to copper working, and that really ties in with Cochrane's work and talking about how indigenous people really interacted with copper. And the concept of a Manitou really poorly translates into English, but they kind of like a spirit, not quite a god, but it's essentially the embodiment of the copper. And I am not the person qualified to necessarily talk about Ojibwe spiritual beliefs. You would have to ask actual members of the community. But looking at copper, though, is there's a connection there, right? There's a connection as you're working the copper. There's a respect that's going into it. And there's an embodiment that the copper has, possibly going all the way back into the Archaic. And we're seeing that the copper is purposely being worked at different spots on the landscape. It's purposely being moved away from Isle Royale. We know that the Ojibwe really revered islands. There's this idea of islandness. You have the concept of kind of even their like different creation myths where, Sky Woman falls from the sky in different stories, depending what you're looking at. And Isle Royale really embodies that idea of islandness and being special. And that's where the copper is coming from. And if you look at what's the copper Manitou, Mishabizi, there's different ways to pronounce it, but
Yeah.
Mishabizi, also known as the Great Spirit or the Great Lynx, I'll just say
Or is it
English because-
Mishapeshu sometimes?
Mishapeju, Mishabizi, Mishiginabeg.
Yeah.
There are different words for it. I know Mishapezu and Mishiginabeg are sometimes considered separate, sometimes they're not. And we even see this in mound construction, which is fascinating. But there's this deep, I don't want to say mythology because I don't think that's the right word, but there's this deep spiritual world that exists within Ojibwe mythos. And with that, you have an upper world and a lower world, right? And in the lower world, don't think heaven and hell, right? We're thinking where we live, thinking the sky, and then thinking down below, as in like underwater, underground. And the copper Manitous are really like the chief Manitous, the chief spirits in that underworld, right? In that underwater realm. If you look at myths surrounding water crossings, if somebody drowns or if they fall through the ice, that is attributed to Mishapezu. It's attributed to the Great Lynx. And you have these various stories and these ideas that are all connected into copper. And of course, why are they connected into copper? Well, because copper is found on an island, right? You're finding the copper on Isle Royale. Even Mishapezu's horns are made of copper. Mishapezu's tail that is used to whip up storms is made of copper. Mishapezu is in conflict with the Thunderbirds, for example. And so you see this just deep connection with copper that I think goes beyond just trying to make a tool and trying to understand that. And with this almost purposeful delaying of making copper on Isle Royale, and you do see finished tools in Isle Royale. There's not
Yeah,
a complete absence of it. You do.
yeah. It's rare for the amount of mines I'm saying, like
It's rare, but my theory with that is
yeah,
that's copper that's almost coming back to the island. That somebody
yeah,
makes
maybe
something and they're using it and they bring it back with them. I don't necessarily think they're making it there. I think they're processing it and they're moving on to the next process site. And another theory you see is like with Winters, you see this idea of storytelling and story ideas with the Ojibwe. And part of it is you tell stories certain times of the year because you don't want necessarily the entity you're telling the story about to overhear you or to hear you. To work copper and to do that, you might not want to do it on Isle Royale right before you cross over with Mishapezu being present, being there. You might want to wait until you're away from there. And this is all, pulling from contemporary examples.
mm-hmm.
And again, the community itself would be the people to go to and ask about their beliefs, not me. But from reading their beliefs as written by people, other outsiders, even people within the community, this is kind of the interpretation that I take out of it, that there's a purposeful delaying of the copper production process, and it's really connected into the relationship that people form with both the copper and their environment, being Isle Royale.
That's so interesting. I can't even believe you're able to test that idea. And I think the way you describe it, it's a really cool approach. And you think the copper, it's utilitarian. So why didn't they just use stone or obsidian or rock? Why did they use metal? Like, what was the advantage of having metal over stone tools for the same things?
Now that you bring that up, actually, I'm going to slightly bring up the new chapter that I had. So that book is from hard rock to heavy metal tool
Yeah.
production and use by indigenous hunter-gatherers in the Lake Superior Basin. It's edited by Michelle Beber and Christopher Wolf. Now, Michelle Beber, a lot of her work focuses on that, looking at the efficiency of, say, stone versus copper, bone versus copper, and trying to kind of focus on that efficiency. What I can tell you about Isle Royale specifically is it's been proposed that, well, maybe they used copper because they didn't have access to lithics. Well, that's not true. We see lithics all over copper production sites. We have a massive quarry of jasper taconite just north of Isle Royale and Thunder Bay, and that taconite's coming onto Isle Royale. On Isle Royale, we do have local knappable material, Portage Lake rhyolite. It's not the best. It's not the worst. I've seen worse. People are using and knapping that, so they have access to stone tools. Some of Michelle Beber's work kind of shows that sometimes copper is more efficient, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's kind of the same. So to say, look at, say, something like efficiency may not be necessarily the case. One of the theories that is had, and Michelle does talk about this within her chapters in the book, is there's an exoticness to copper, right? There's a special quality to copper. And you see this with studies within archaeometallurgy too. People talk about, why did people begin using metals to begin with? And often the conclusion, Cyril Stanley Smith is kind of like one of the founders of archaeometallurgy, if you will. And he talks about this, is people aren't going to metals because they can do something. It's not for their function. It's other qualities. It's the luster, it's the malleability, it's the sound they make. It's the different qualities that make copper and metal unique, not just their function in a tool form that people are attracted to and that people use versus, say, a lithic tool. Yes, do they use it for a functional tool? Of course, because in their lives, that's what they use every day, right? If you're using a knife every day, it makes sense that you would turn it into a knife because in your conceptualization of the world, that makes sense. If I have, for example, I obviously like copper. I have a pure copper water bottle I use. It just makes sense because I like copper. So somebody got me it as a gift. You know what I mean? And things like that. So it's gonna not take the place of, but it's gonna be used along the stuff you use every day, right?
Okay.
And that's not to say it's not special. And then using it every day is going to be that interaction. Now, my chapter in this book is called Miskawebek's Journey Beyond Manong. And I got to look at the actual second part of that title because
Yeah, I have it written down too.
there we go. The life history of native copper production among archaic hunter-gatherers in the northern Lake Superior Basin. Now, this actually is a direct chapter from my dissertation, slightly edited, and this is the chapter that kind of goes along with talking about the hotspot analysis. But essentially, what I do here is I look at the life history of copper. Now, the life history approach, it comes from what's called behavioral archaeology, and it kind of looks at how people act and do things based off technology, really simply for behavioral archaeology, who probably are going to hate that definition I just gave. But the life history approach comes from what's called the chain abattoir, which is called the operational sequence in English. And this is this idea in archaeology that we can recreate production processes. So we go and recreate it. If you want to work copper, you follow it from A to Z and how you do that. The life history approach takes this a little further, and you really do is you start from every aspect of a material's life cycle. So in my chapter, I start with copper mining. Where are the deposits? What do the deposits look like? How is the copper deposited? How are people mining it? And then I go all the way through copper production. I talk about transportation. I talk about use, discard. Why are we finding it where we're finding it? All the way up to recovery. So all the way from, the copper is formed in a geologic deposit to this piece of copper now exists in a museum in wherever else, wherever the various spots are. And really tracking that in order to understand a couple important things, particularly the technological knowledge that goes into the copper production process. And it was also through this process that I was able to then take a look at the different, I talked about the interaction between people, the environment, and their things, right? This chapter is what allowed me to do that because I could go through and identify the different points where people are interacting with their environment in certain ways, they're interacting with copper in a certain way, they're doing that at different locations, other materials are coming in. It's not, copper is not the only thing, right? There's also water, there's also stone, there's all these other things that are coming in there. And that's what I do in this chapter essentially is I track all of that stuff and I kind of explain it out. And I explain then the technological knowledge that goes into this. There's really three things that make up technological knowledge. One of them is a recipe. So in order to make something made of copper, what do you have to do? Because I can teach you a recipe. I can teach you to work copper, right? I can sit you down and hammer the copper and you'll eventually make a piece. But then there's what's called techno science, right? And this is not just knowing how to make the piece, but understanding how to make the piece. So you understand, as I described annealing earlier, you understand how the process of annealing actually works. You understand that you're regrowing the crystal, you're restructuring it. Maybe not on a microscopic level, but you know that you have to heat it up because what happens. And that's the techno science that comes in. So there's recipes. How do you get from point A to point B? There's the techno science to actually understand really the science behind it. And then there's the generational kind of passing down of this. If I know all this knowledge about copper working, and this is going on for thousands of years, well, obviously I'm not the only one to know it, right? I'm teaching other people, I'm teaching younger people. How is this being perpetuated? Who's doing it? How is it being taught? How's it going? Is this, for example, if you were to go look at a modern industry for road construction, right? It's being taught in universities, it's being taught in schools. These people don't necessarily know each other. The next guy shows up, he gets on the job training, right? That's the generational knowledge. In say copper working, you're going to have more of a hands-on technological knowledge. It's probably going to be family members. It could be specific people in a group. We don't know that. That's kind of hard to judge from the archaeological record. Mm-hmm. It could be, father to son, mother to daughter, whole family groups. It could be very specific people in a community. But what we do know is it's being passed down some ways. And looking at this life history, looking at the various aspects, like I said, starting with, procurement all the way to recovery. Why do we find it? Where we find it? Where are we keeping it? That's part of the copper's life history. And that's kind of what I go through in this publication.
Okay, I guess then I want to run about an idea, a hypothesis I have by you. And I did talk about it a little bit in my book behind me, Great Water, the malleability hypothesis of copper as a, more functionally efficient in terms of malleability. This is some avenue that, as you mentioned, Michelle Beber has not looked at with her work because she looks at the functional efficiency of knives to cut and projectile points, so copper to poke into something versus stone. And basically, long story short, finds that native copper projectile points and knives aren't functionally much better than their lithic counterparts. But I think she's missing an approach, and that is copper does have, I guess, a unique luster, but if it's a utilitarian artifact, its use is not so much its luster, it's its function, I would say. Therefore, the luster probably was a secondary characteristic that was valued, I would say, in the sound. Maybe it was the fact that it could be turned into hooks. Hooks made of metal, copper, are vastly more efficient than hooks made of bone, wood, antler, teeth, shell. But no one's actually done this work. My opinion is copper hooks would make better hooks. Once you have hooks, why would that be important? Well, you're on the greatest freshwater fishery in the world, not to mention Lake Superior and the islands within Isle Royale, all these inland lakes like Dog Lake. And these are deep water lakes, the Great Lakes. And so you need to be able to access deep in the water. especially through the ice, because it's a very cold climate. And I think having hooks made of metal was maybe there was a functional advantage to those. And we're biased in our artifact remains because most of them are terrestrially lost artifacts. We do find a lot of fish hooks, but I think the
We
vast
do.
majority of them are going to be, of course, lost under the water. Therefore, we're going to be biased towards terrestrial copper artifacts, terrestrial uses like projectile points and what have you.
And if we're comparing them to organic hooks too, it's also going to be biased there too, right? Because you're
Yeah,
not
and
necessarily going to find those same
exactly.
things.
And no one's actually done this work. Some people think, if copper's too soft, it'll, if you have a heavy fish on there, it'll straighten out. But not if you look at some of these copper hooks, the shafts are triangular shaped. And another thing is they're sometimes put on the front of spears to hook on to fish in the water.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the shape of the hook, the shaft it being triangulated, if it's cold or heated or cold worked, is going to make it harder or softer. I think these would have all been known, these factors. And the reason this malleability hypothesis is so important is because this explains why I think copper was so integral. If you just look at it from a straight economic standpoint, it was useful for creating technologies for living on water, fishing, woodworking, making boats, birch bark canoes, awls, you need holes. And if you have more copper, you can create better technology for fishing and canoes. And then you have a natural feedback loop because populations get used to that and they need more of it. And this would explain why it wasn't just float copper. I think this is an important thing that I want to hear your opinion on. They clearly could find float copper. It's found everywhere. I found a piece when I was up there this summer. It's all over. But the fact that people mined and went, and it was so extensively mined and quarried, if you want to call it quarried, that suggests to me that a regular supply of copper was becoming critical. Like they needed it on a regular basis to be able to access it. That means to me that it's pretty important and vital to their economic worldview. And I think you're taking more of a cultural, spiritual view of this. But I guess my take is I think we're missing this malleability hypothesis. And just what are your thoughts? I want to hear both supporting or against, or what. I want to hear your full ideas on that.
Yeah, happy to share my opinion on it. And I alluded to this earlier and talked about it a little bit. It's the qualities of metals that make them so unique and make them so important. It's not necessarily just, like I said, I have a thing that can cut, I can make another thing that can cut. But there are qualities to them that make them unique. The ability to, say, make a fish hook and curve that around. That malleability is something stone doesn't have. One of the things I talk about actually in the last publication is you often look at stone as a reductive technology. To make something a stone, you take something away. You look at ceramics as a additive technology. In order to make a pot, you have to add water, you have to add temper, clay. Metals are a transformative technology. You can take something and you can essentially make it into something else without taking or adding anything to it, right? And that's the thing with copper, right? That's that malleability that you're talking about, that you're able to then work it into, say, a fish hook or something such as that. One thing I'll say about float copper, there is a disadvantage of float copper, and I think Larry pointed this out to me at one point, is that essentially it's picked up by the glaciers and tumble, 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 tumble. It is essentially excessively hard worked, which means it's brittle and it's full of flaws. And if you were to then only rely on float copper, you're going to be working with copper that has a lot of flaws in it. That's not to say you can't find good pieces. You definitely can. But you got to control those pieces. If you're to go and get a piece that's still in the ground and you're mining it yourself, as we talked about, maybe you're setting that fire to keep it that way, you're then working with a potentially better, high quality piece of copper. Now, again, I haven't tested that either. But that's one idea with that is why you would go and mine it. As for fish hooks, yeah, that'd be a really interesting study to do. I know I've seen fish hooks of like bone. They're almost like straight, and then they have the thing, and then when they swallow them, it's not a hook, right? It's like a straight thing. And it would be really interesting. I know Michelle Beber, she has a laboratory of experimental archaeology where she runs experiments. A lot of the work is, like you said, it's been looking at kind of impact stuff and kind of like penetration. I know she's done stuff with alls, she's done sort of the projectile points. That might be another interesting study for her and her students to possibly pick up, having a lab, having students interested in some of the stuff. That might be a designated, a source
Yeah.
that could always be knocked upon. Like, hey, you guys interested in a study like this? Because, a lot of these ideas, right? Somebody hasn't, let's test it, right?
Hmm. I'm hoping to inspire it with this conversation, because maybe we'll reach out, or I'll reach out and find out, it makes sense. I know there's fish hooks in the Pacific from the Pleistocene. And like you said, they're big and they're made of mollusk shells, and they bend themselves essentially in a bigger mouth fish. Like they embed themselves in the fish mouth. It's not like a hook that we see with iron with the barbs. The issue we have with Lake Superior, and it may not be an issue, maybe I am not fully up to speed on literature, but the fish shapes of the mouth in Lake Superior would have been very small. And the shape of the mouth is very important for the fish,
Hmm.
or for the hook. And so there's things that have to go into that. Like, you can make hooks with shell for catching big mouth fish, but small mouth fish, you certainly need smaller hooks. And smaller hooks are a lot harder to make with bone and shell. So then I think smaller hooks would be more copper metal friendly. Again, all this needs work, but it could explain, you could, I think, make the case for small hooks. Metal is functionally more efficient. It can be recycled. I don't know how the heck you could test that. You'd have to have an aquarium with fish and different hooks. I don't even know how you would do
Just
it.
go fishing. Yeah.
Yeah, we did that this summer. We took rooster tails made of copper, iron. We couldn't catch anything on the old copper reproduced fish hook, but it's kind of hard to have controlled experiments when you're getting stuck in the weeds and you're trying to.
What if
You
like a
catch,
stocked pond would be the solution to that, where they're like, you're going to get a bite,
yeah, and like a camera. We were even, we're thinking.
Yeah.
I think maybe ice fishing would be better with the GoPro down there.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then, because then you
'Cause
have,
it's just dangling and it's got
you're
bait on it.
dangling and you're on the ice and you're not moving
And
with
they
the
would have been
current.
ice fishing.
Right. And
Are
then
you
you could really
familiar
get
with
in that.
Lewis Binford's paper, The Archaeology of Anthropology?
No, I know
So this
Binford,
is,
but
yeah, so Binford's a big name in archaeology. He's kind of, they credit him as the founder of processual archaeology, which is really a scientific approach to archaeology. Well, the paper he wrote was kind of like talking about, that you can do archaeology as anthropologists. That's unimportant. The important part of this paper for our purposes, it is an important paper, but is that his case study is the old copper complex. And it's really one of the first like professional archaeological publications about it. Give it a read if you haven't. But one of his ideas with kind of and actually Weber actually kind of talks about Binford's work a lot, but one of his ideas looking at this is with the Nipissing is the reason you see this fluorescence of copper is because of the exploitation of aquatic resources is one of his
really,
theories. Yeah. So
yeah,
as you were saying, that's what I was thinking. So that's definitely worth the read. I haven't read it in a couple years. It's like a really important paper. I think it came out in like 1960 or something like
yeah,
that.
it's
So
a
it's an
long
older
time.
one.
Mm-hmm.
But
That,
in like yeah.
how
Good.
do the going on along the lines of that thinking, when you look at the mine pits on Isle Royale, how do you feed those people? This is a pre-agricultural world in the Archaic. And you could say, oh, well, they had to have been gathering, hunting, etc. On Isle Royale,
Fishing.
there's caribou, but I do think fishing again.
Definitely fishing.
And then this is where the hooks are important. Fishing was very important to the economy of the miners, the actual food of the miners, the energy, I guess, let's say. And we see that historically on the West Coast that these societies that were fairly complex survived off of salmon runs. And they existed alongside people that had maize and practiced agriculture, and they still survived and became fairly complex societies living off of marine resources. I think that's what we're seeing out in Isle Royale. Again, the copper was important, I think, for the fishing, and fishing was an important part of supporting the mining economy.
And it's all integrated together, right? These are not necessarily full-time miners where your only job is to go mine. These are people they're exploiting multiple resources at the same time, right? Isle Royale's great fishing. If you've never been fishing on Isle Royale, it's worth the trip. But I know you have, Dave. But
Yeah.
But these are multi-resource extraction places. You're not just going out there and getting copper and that's it. And you're just sitting out there doing copper. You're doing other things. You're fishing. You have to eat, right? I know during the more contemporary period, we see indigenous people going out and getting maple sugar from some of the
You're right.
stands up on the islands, Maple Ridge over on the west side of the island. And you're definitely doing that. So
Hmm.
fishing, it's all integrated. And back to, like I said, with the integration, interaction between people, environment, and things, that's one of them, right? You're going out there and you're not just mining copper. Maybe you mine copper in the morning, you went fishing in the afternoon. That interaction, those are associated together. And then you're, as you said, you're then using the copper to go fishing. I know that they found a lot of fishing hooks up on the North Shore. Um,
Hmm.
the collections up there are full of them, but as you mentioned, being an angler myself, most of my fish hooks are in the bottom of the lake.
Yeah. So we're gonna just be naturally biased towards those terrestrial copper artifacts, but I think that's a route we need to look at. This hooks, like copper was an important part of the archaic economy because it's utilitarian. This is all my opinion. And I'm not indigenous. I guess you don't know that, but I'm not an indigenous person. So I don't bring that perspective to the table. I can only bring, I guess, my Western view. But that is, to me, I think, a route to look at for the functional efficiency hypothesis. We'll leave it at that, I guess. Okay, now, what was I going to I had something I really wanted to ask you about. Oh, the decline of mining. Now, this is I guess, not a settled subject, but it
Notice
does
that.
appear, let's see if we'll see where we're on the same page about and then see where we differ. It seems as though, looking at radiocarbon dates, I've analyzed a bunch of radiocarbon dates from there and looking at my lake sediment research, it seems as though the old copper complex, the old copper culture style, large utilitarian, heavy tool technology seems to diminish or become rare after about 5,000 to 3,000 years ago. By 3,000 years ago, the old copper complex, let's say, and that style of tool beyond the all is rare or absent. And metallurgy in the Mississippi and the woodland period, especially along the Mississippi River, is way different style in a lot of ways, but in some ways, I guess there's this similarity. Do you buy that the old copper industry sort of declined in the middle archaic and that's reflected in the change in the artifacts? Or do you think otherwise?
It's not something I personally have studied in detail. Like I said, I know Michelle Beber has put a lot of thought and work into this. My stance on it is more that I think demands and technology change. I think Kathleen Earhart has a really good paper kind of walking through the different periods of
I know
old
that
kind
one.
of metal use. In terms of old copper complex, I'm gonna, this is a side note almost. When talking about metallurgy as a whole, I often use the phrase native copper industry to talk about everything versus, as you mentioned there, old copper complex is spatially and temporally bound. And I think people often, and you were not doing this by the way, but people will often just talk about everything as old copper complex, and that's not the case. Old copper complex is spatially and temporally bound. It's definitely based in the archaic, particularly the middle archaic, a little bit into the late archaic, and it's primarily centered in like Wisconsin and kind of the surrounding areas there. So I think that's important to throw out to anybody listening, what we mean when we say old copper complex versus say the native copper industry.
And then old copper culture is kind of, I just use that word because it's found on the internet a lot, but that's like the outdated version of saying old copper complex, maybe a more narrowly defined.
People debate if it's old copper complex, old
Or
copper culture, old
culture,
copper
yeah.
industry. I don't really think it matters. Personally, I think it is an industry. So people, initially industry, people pushed away from that, but I'm like, well, it is an industry, so I see no problem with it. But I think you start getting lost in the weeds when you start debating the very specific terms. But like I said, it's worth defining what we're actually
Yeah.
talking about, where we're talking about, that kind of stuff. But I think the technology shifts because what you see is a lot of the technology during the archaic, it's really based off of whole large pieces of copper, right? As you mentioned, probably mined pieces of copper. You're essentially working them into a bar, working them into a preform, and then finishing off your tool. That's the goal every time you pretty much work a piece, right? Work it down into a bar and then work it into something else, no matter the size of the bar. What you see as we enter into the woodland, particularly in, say, Hopewell uses or even Adena, is copper begins being worked in sheets. You see copper being flattened out, and it's used for other purposes rather than just utilitarian use. Now, we do see a shift away from these large, heavy utilitarian items, but we never see a discontinued use of smaller copper items. Awls are used pretty much in all periods of time, and all being, think of a very small pointed piece of copper, and you'd use it for, say, leather working or something such as that, because it's got a pointy end, and copper awls are really nice when you're trying to do leather working. We see those all the way into the Mississippian periods. We see a lot of these smaller tools being used. They never go away. And I know I've done work on the Angel Mound site down on the southern Indiana border, and there's a lot of copper awls down and sites like that. Another thing you see with these later periods, particularly Hopewell and down into the Mississippian, is a lot of these. So with the Hopewell interaction sphere and the Mississippian cultures, a lot of these aren't just the really ritualistic items as we see being made. One of the best examples I can think of, it's from the Man site down in Indiana, and it's a copper headdress with antlers coming off of it, and it's made all of copper except the antlers. And this would likely be worn in some sort of ceremony, as far as we can tell. There used to be a replica on display at the Glenn Black Laboratory. They just renovated the IU modded, so I don't know what's on display anymore because I haven't been down there since. But you used to be able to go and see a replica of this at least. There's this really, like I said, we call it ceremonial use of copper, but the utilitarian doesn't just disappear. We're still seeing awls being made. We're still seeing smaller tools, but the size of the pieces, you don't see these huge pieces. And my
Right.
theory is the reason you don't see a lot of these big pieces is because they're being made into sheet copper. I think that
Mm.
changes. Instead of making a huge copper point, you're instead hammering it flat and making some of these more complex, because you see a lot of them in the Hopewell. You see really intricate
Oh
geometric
yeah.
designs and animal designs, and they're thick. It takes a lot of copper to do that, and it takes a lot of skill to do that. Well, where are you getting that copper? Well, instead of maybe taking that large piece of copper, make it into a spear or an axe, maybe you're hammering it out, making it into something else. So that's some of the change I think we see. And we also see a shift into more of an extensive trade too. The Hopewell interaction sphere wasn't an interaction sphere. We see items and kind of exotic goods coming from all over North America coming into this. Same thing with, Mississippian culture. There's copper workshops at Cahokia. We see
Yeah.
copper items in some of the burials there. I think, was it Mound 72 has that large copper rod in it, if I'm
Yeah.
remembering
Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah.
So the copper use doesn't disappear, but it definitely changes. It 100% changes, and there's
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
shifts in culture, and it's probably related to a lot of complex things in lifestyles. And I know with the Mississippians, you see agriculture come in. You see the mound building start. There's different things happening beyond just copper, right?
What? So from my perspective as a lake sediment guy, we see there's no evidence for intensive mining across the Keweenaw and Isle Royale after about 5,300 years ago. I just say 5,000 years ago because with the radiocarbon era.
Yeah, yeah.
That supports to me, like there's a decline in the mining industry activity inferred from lake sediments, and we don't see any evidence. We haven't covered every part of Lake Superior, so let's pretend that the industry just dissolves or becomes undetectable. Then that makes sense that would then translate into the actual artifacts on the ground, because then all of a sudden, if the mining is declined, then the supply to the societies goes down. It becomes more of a specialized material,
That
and
makes sense.
it feeds into it. And again, I mentioned that in my book too, but none of this is officially, it's all my gut feeling and things. And I think that has something to do with it, that the mining intensive enough to leave a signal in lake sediment is no longer detected after 5,000 years ago. There could be pecking, people grab float copper, or clearly copper's in the area, people are using it, but maybe they're not mining it to a degree that can leave a signal, at least northern Keweenaw and the areas we looked at on Isle Royale. Why is that? And I think one issue, there's two things I've written a couple hypotheses. One interesting route is this drought. Have
Mm,
you looked at like Elk Lake in southern Minnesota? 5,000 years ago, nearly
mhm.
dries out. It's a pretty deep lake. I mean, right around 5,200 years ago. The evidence is like the lake levels go down very, very low. And then if you look at like Green Lake in New York, some other lakes in Ontario, right north of the Great Lakes, same thing. Mid Holocene, there seems to be a drought or a change in climate. That's interesting. I'm not trying to fully endorse an environmentally deterministic kind of hypothesis here, but because first of all, they didn't rely on agriculture as far as we know, and this is an industry on Lake Superior which didn't dry out. There's no evidence the Great Lakes themselves dried out, but it does seem to be a turbulent time in terms of Middle Holocene climate. So did that disturb the trade networks, etc. I think it might have added stress. My thinking now is that we are running into a diminishing returns issue in the Middle
Mm.
Holocene. And that's another thing I bring up in the book, is that the easy to access copper mines, the veins, the high quality stuff, it's picked clean. I mean, it's below the rock. So it may still be there, but you have to get it out a 20-foot hole now. And you have to clear out.
Hits I've seen mining, they're not, you don't get to the bottom. There's just a shiny copper vein at the bottom. They're empty. They're, people mined them.
Yeah.
They took the copper that was there.
So I think if it's true that people are mining since the glaciers, or, utilizing copper there since the glaciers left, 10, 12,000 years ago, by the Middle Holocene, are we running into a diminishing returns where it's just too expensive to mine copper anymore? All the easy access sites are gone. They don't have iron technology. They don't have dynamite. So they are limited to what they can do. And eventually it gets to the point where it's like, this is just not worth it anymore. And then you might have a drought hit you and things just go haywire. Can you give me your thoughts on, do you think this diminishing returns idea is plausible or not?
It's definitely plausible. I mean, and one thing I was thinking about as you were saying that is, if the glaciers come through and you have copper pretty evident on the surface, you don't have soil accumulation, you can access that, right? You go in, you mine it, you access it. Over time, soil accumulates, covers up some of the veins and posits. You're mining what you can. All of a sudden, because the original theories I had heard was that, well, flow copper would have been used first and then they mined it. But my thought is, what if that's the opposite? What if you came into this environment and you see these veins of copper and you access it? And then over time, as you mentioned, right, all of a sudden, it's easier to go access the flow copper. Like, why are we sitting here hard rock mining when we can go grab it from the flow? And maybe that's, another factor into that, right? All of a sudden there's a switch, and which one's easier? Well, it's way easier just to go dig through gravel versus, and then, like I said, maybe you can't see the veins anymore on the surface. The ones you know about are, you've been mining them for what, 2,000 years, depending on your dates there. Like that's a lot of mining. And that's definitely a plausible theory, I'd say.
Interesting. And I think I'm glad you're on board, because I think that's another one we need to pursue or think about, that the diminishing returns. There's body of literature like Edward, or is his name Joseph Tainer. He looks at the economics of resource extraction, and then like returns and costs. And if you look at these curves, the returns you get versus the costs, they'll hit like a point, and costs are too great. We see that in all resource extraction. This is, that's the whole point of that guy's paper, is that this diminishing returns theory is found so much. Like when you cut trees, what do? You cut the easiest ones to get, then you go up the hills. And then you go get to the point, and then harder and harder. And then all of a sudden it's like, this whole valley's not even worth it anymore. We have to go way up here. Or anything with, we first drilled for oil where? Titusville, Pennsylvania, where a guy puts a water well 100 feet in the ground, and it makes a gusher come out. And they're catching light, sweet crude, very low sulfur crude. It's like the easiest to refine. Now, we have to suck tar out of Alberta, northern Alaska, out in the Gulf of Mexico, because all these light, sweet crude West Texas oil fields, Western Pennsylvania, they're just trickling oil at this point, compared to what they used to do.
With iron mining, one of the things you see is we'll actually go back and reprocess like smelting piles and all those waste stuff, because technologically we can pull more out of that, because it's just easier to go do that than go try to find, because we don't have that good stuff on the surface anymore.
That happened in the Keweenaw too. They mined the original tailing piles were then refined. They took more copper out of them, and because it made more sense. So that is a thing we see in mining and resource extraction. Diminishing returns is a phenomenon, and this would explain, because the decline in mining in the Mid-Holocene, it didn't, as far as my work is concerned with lake sediment, it didn't reactivate. You have to explain that, because it was prior to 5,000 years ago, there's multiple spikes. In some lakes, there's 4, like the northern Keweenaw, the southern Keweenaw, there's only 1. Isle Royale, there's only 1 at McCargo Cove. It's varying depending on where you're at and the amount of lead spikes. So that means that mining was happened in multiple episodes, and it was abandoned and then reactivated, and then abandoned and maybe reactivated twice or three times. After 5,000 years ago, why couldn't it reactivate? There were clearly indigenous people living on Lake Superior. If diminishing returns is a thing, then that would explain why it could not reactivate. It would have been too costly to reactivate without iron technology, without dynamite, without fossil fuel energy. It wasn't worth it. That's why it's better than the drought, because the drought could, clearly it didn't. The drought hit and then it went away. So if it was a drought and the drought went away, why didn't it reactivate 3,000 years ago or something, when climate was better suited to your activities? Diminishing returns, though, I think fills in that gap of the continued lack of evidence. And I think you add in diminishing returns with a social stress like a drought, you could, I think, maybe push the tipping point. And there's some other random little things I've heard in there too, like a fish ecologist, I mentioned this too. And they're like, Lake Superior is a very delicate fishery. And if he wasn't sure, and I'm not sure, and maybe more people will get into this if I talk about it, if you dry out that lake enough that the water, the spawning grounds in the creeks for the fish around the lakes, they can't get up to spawn. After a couple years, you could have a collapse in the fish population. If the spawning grounds are, you can imagine a case where it's so dry, if it's that dry that even the summer creeks are trickling and there's just no way for any fish to get up there to spawn. That would cascade into the fishery, maybe lead to some sort of catastrophic fishery collapse in Lake Superior without necessarily drying it out.
And I mean, there's a drop in lake level at the end of the Nipissing too. I mean, that's
Right.
going to affect where your shoreline is, where water running into it. That's going to change everything. Because none of this is happening in a vacuum, right? All these different things. You have lake level changing. You do have environmental changes all throughout the last 10,000 years.
Right.
All of that is factoring in. You know what I mean? It's not just necessarily copper, or it's compounding issues. So if there's say, as you're mentioning, kind of that diminishing return, but then all these other things are happening, something could get pushed to the side or abandoned. There's also could be knowledge lost, or there could be things like that. Not that knowledge was lost, but it could be. There could be, things where an elders is really the one leading the mining, and 200 years goes by and nobody does it, and then you're not back to square one. Maybe you have copper with you a little bit, but now you're like, oh, well, how do we get this out? So you're going through, and there's, like I said, it's not a vacuum. There's multiple things happening.
Mm-hmm. Now, you brought up earlier Indigenous stories, and I kind of want to end this off our conversation. We have been talking for 2.5 hours. It's been awesome. I want to get into, though, the Indigenous stories of old copper industry in the old copper society. It's been an interest of mine. I guess it stems from a couple things. Firstly, as you're probably aware, the old copper mines have spawned sort of a pseudo archaeological movement online, and I get emails. Have you been getting emails from people about their conspiracies on old copper and connections with Egypt? And
I've had people run me down at conferences and public talks, but I don't get any emails now.
I get some every once in a while, maybe a few a year, of just, I can't even. There's just so many crazy theories, so much interest though in the old copper mines, and us overlooking the story there. There seems to be like the archaeologists are ignoring us. There's missing copper. There's this and that. And I realized after, researching up there, I extracted sediment cores to test, to figure out when the mining happened. I was like, I'm a scientist on the ground attempting to gather real data to shed light, using the scientific method on the history of the mines. And I remember, I brought this up. I was getting gas right across from the Mackinac Bridge. And some guy, I told him what I was doing there, and he was cornering me in the gas station. I had like the canoe, I was like doing fieldwork, and he was telling me about they're ignoring the history and the Vikings and all this stuff. So fast forward, I finished these studies and I did the radiocarbon paper looking at all the radiocarbon evidence I could find on old copper. I published that in Radiocarbon, and Science Magazine found it and got us on. I think Michelle and I were on this article, and it was like as viral as any paleolimnologist could ever go. I mean, I still see it shared. I remember seeing across every social media. It was like crazy, and I was getting emails, and I was like, there's a serious interest here. There's a marketable interest. And so I wrote that book, Great Water, as an attempt to fill in for this lack of public information on the true, fantastic, real story of old copper, which is intricately tied in with the indigenous history there. I wanted to make a popular piece of writing that could be out there for people that are interested to find and Google, so that they could actually be maybe directed towards the true, and actually I would say more fantastic story, that this is the oldest this is the oldest metalworking industry in the world. I mean, it's almost more fantastic than the conspiracy theories that like a hidden Viking trail came, or the Phoenicians and what have you. How what is your how do you think we can go forward as scientists to improve the public education and um I don't know, help us shape the story more so that it honors the real history of what the indigenous people of North America have accomplished? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a really good question because, what the impact of what we do makes a difference. Somebody once told me that archaeologists have one of the most fascinating jobs there ever is, and the only person that could ever make archaeology boring is an archaeologist. We are not the best as a field about communicating with the general public, both as academics, both as cultural resource managers. I know from the cultural resource management side, there's definitely a fear, a palpable fear of the destruction of sites, right? You want to preserve things, you want to keep things from being destroyed. You know what I mean? You don't want somebody coming in on a weekend and saying, "Oh, this is really cool. It would look great in my living room." Understandable. It is cool. It would look great in your living room, but unfortunately, you know what I mean? If you take it and put it in your living room, it's no longer there as an archaeological resources, and the data is lost from something like that. And on the academic side, a lot of the publications, a lot of the things, they come out in journals, and those journals are behind paywalls, and you can't access them. And often they're written in a way for other archaeologists to understand, right? It's written a lot more scientific. It's written with a lot of rigor. We do peer reviews. That's all great for us, but as you mentioned, with you trying to write your book, is what's out there for the general public. I've seen some books. I know Susan Martin's book is
Yeah.
something a lot of people are very familiar with, Wonderful Power. That book, in my opinion, it's kind of written as a cross between. As a
Yeah,
student
right.
starting off with this, I found it a great resource for me because it had
Same
a lot
here.
of good information. But at the same time, I feel like a lay person who's not an expert in this picking it up could understand it very easily. It's meant to be kind of that in between versus a lot of other books are hard. And having those, like I said, those paywalls for articles and things like that. And also articles are often very specific, right? They're often like, I did a study on this and this was my results. And those are great, like I said, for academics and resource managers and those of us in that community. But what about people outside? And that you could, I could harp on the same thing. Well, just continued, what I mean, public education and continued
Yeah.
public things that obviously helps. It obviously continues to make a difference. You're running a podcast on this right now, right? That's
Yeah, I was
that's
gonna say.
something people are doing that. I know, Larry Furrow and Rob Mueller, they have their Facebook page, and a lot of people post on that. Things get disseminated on that. Larry's very active on that and commenting, kind of like nudging people in the right direction. I see him do that all the time.
Yeah.
These are all little things
Yeah.
that are all coming together, right, to do that. As for I wish I had an answer for some big shift that we could do, right? Well, we just need to do this, right? And it'll solve all of our problems. I recently just read, I don't know if you saw this posted, a dissertation actually talking about, different ideas and conspiracy
Oh,
theories by
yeah.
Donovan Murphy, I believe
Yeah,
is his
at
name.
Michigan Tech. Yeah, I saw that it came out, but I have not read it.
Yeah, I read it through. I was sitting there in a hotel room at work one evening, and I said, I'm just going to read this, and he did a really good job walking a line of like, hey, I want to talk to these people and be very respectful for them, but I also want to like look at these issues. You don't because how you don't change people's opinions is walking up to them and saying, you know what, you're wrong. Everything you think is wrong. All of your ideas are wrong. That's not how you communicate with somebody. So if somebody has a deeply seated belief, no matter what it is, whether it's a conspiracy, a theory, or is genuine truth, and not that there's a such thing as genuine truth in science, but because science is really the accumulation of our current knowledge. Science is going to change, and that's one of the most important
Yeah.
things, I think. Just kind of putting a message out there right now is that science is not fact, science is not truth. Science is what the knowledge currently supports, and that will change, and that will change as we go into the future. And say with the old copper complex and the native copper industry, those of us, academics and researchers and cultural resource managers and coring specialists who are supporting all of this. Well, the idea that we're putting forward and the things that we're putting forward are not this ideal holy truth, but instead it's, hey, this is what the evidence currently supports. Looking at this, looking at the evidence, we don't see evidence for this. If we did find it, that'd be cool. We should talk about it. But we don't see evidence for it, nor are we hiding evidence for it. I think there's a lot of mistrust and misinformation about what's being hidden.
Right.
I
Right.
know that most, if people actually got to peer inside of the world of archaeology, you would realize we don't have the money to hide things
Hi,
from you.
thanks.
We do our best to keep sites from being looted, and that's about the extent of what we're able to do. We're not hiding these big conspiracies. I've worked for the federal government. I work for the state of Wisconsin right now. I've been at academic institutions. We lack money, actually. We lack the ability to do basic research most of the time. So there's often not these conspiracy and hidden things that people are hiding. And so I think kind of pushing forward those ideas, not to say, hey, you're wrong about your ideas, but like, hey, like, we're not hiding anything from you. If we did find that hidden Minoan ship as an archaeologist, I guarantee you that would make my career. Like if I found that and I published all about it, that my career's made. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I'm gonna have a nice tenure track job at some point. But as of date, we have it as a thing, and we're kind of moving that line forward as we're doing more of the research. We just talked for the past 2.5 hours about a lot of the research I've been a part of and involved with old copper complex. We didn't really hold anything back. I think the only thing we didn't mention was like site locations. That's not something as an archaeologist we are going to reveal because we don't want them looted. And that's
Yeah.
like I said, that's the extent of things we're hiding. We just don't want things to be destroyed, and we want them to be preserved for the future. So I mean, keep doing, what you're doing, Dave, Larry, if you're listening to this at some point, keep doing that kind of stuff. And, just kind of slowly pushing that line forward and trying to educate and I think just being gentle and talking with people. I had somebody chase me not chase me out, but I was walking out of a conference and they chased me down because they wanted to
Yeah.
ask me about Vikings in the Great Lakes.
Oh yeah. As you say,
I told the guy, I was like, hey, I'm walking over there. I'm like, why don't you walk with me? He goes, sure. And we walked and talked for 10 minutes. I just kind of talked about it with him. I didn't run from him. I wasn't like, no, you're wrong. Get away from me. It was just, yeah, let's talk about it. And we went for a walk, and I, kind of gave him that little spiel I gave about like, yeah, if we found stuff on that, we're not hiding it. That's how we make our careers as academics. We make our careers on publishing the newest, coolest thing.
yeah.
It's just the truth. The person who
Yeah.
found Lonson Meadows was famous for finding Lonson Meadows, saying, yeah, the Vikings were in North America. If you found the Lonson Meadows in the Great Lakes, that's how you're making your career. Like we don't hide that. We want it out there because that's how your name gets known. So yeah, I don't know if that directly answered that question, but
I think that's a good thing to bring up is this missing and hiding. And because another thing you see online with regard to the copper is the missing artifacts. There's billions of pounds of copper estimated based on this guy, Fred, and they're missing. And even the guy that's made those estimates has taken it back, and it's completely arbitrary. But I will say there are hundreds, maybe thousands of copper mines / quarries, pits, what you have, when you're going to call them. And there are likely thousands of copper artifacts. I wouldn't call them missing. They're lost. They're lost over prairies and lakes and forests under.
we have so much known copper, and part of it too is we have no idea how much copper is removed from the mines. There's actually no way to calculate
there's
that.
no way to calculate
It's
it.
impossible. I can tell you that for a fact. It's impossible. You can't calculate that. As for where did the artifacts go, there is copper artifacts all over Wisconsin. I mean, farmers are pulling it up in their field. Most of it, to be honest with you, is sitting in people's private collections and in government facilities.
Yeah.
And not because it's being hidden, just because they found it and they put it in a box and it goes into a collection.
Yeah.
It's there. There are not just like tens of thousands of copper artifacts, hundreds of thousands all over Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula, Minnesota, Ontario. It's all here. Like
It's all
there's
here.
copper's here.
I think
There's
we
not a
need to
missing amount of
emphasize
copper.
that, because just among the public, most people don't even know Native Americans before Columbus used metals, period, let alone that there's thousands of artifacts, maybe hundreds of thousands of artifacts in the Midwest. And I think if we can just get that fact out there, then all of a sudden this missing idea, like they're putting treasure chests and shipped over to the, I don't know, Cyprus or something to be in that ship.
They had
Is
copper.
Yeah, it's we just need to know that they're here, they're not missing, they're probably lost is better term maybe. But there, yeah, like you said, lots of them are found. And when you're up in the Keweenaw and you grew up in the area and you talk
Hmm.
to, Uncle Joe has this, Steve, my neighbor, has that, and we have a barrel of hammerstones that we found in this guy's pit. I mean, that happened to me this summer actually, where the guy's like, yeah, we found a bunch of these in this pit right over like when I was near Adventure. I'm like, oh great, so you guys just dug them all out, like.
That's what happens. That's why most, like, if you look at like mound building culture in Wisconsin, most of them are destroyed. People plowing their fields. They just
Mhm.
whatever. They want to plow a field. They're gone
Yeah,
now.
and they're gone. So but you then that also is a testament to me that like just how common it is. And this is not like early Copper Age in Eastern Europe and the Balkans and Asia Minor, where you, like you said, you find two little things and you're like, oh, we have metals. I mean, everybody has them. It's not like a rare archaeological find. I mean, it's a lot of stuff is found, and we just don't. It's just not known. So my book Great Water was an attempt to try to tell that story a little bit in an easier way for the public, and also the more ridiculous historical accounts going up there, like talking about Douglas Houghton, who was a character, and other people that like Charles Whittlesley. I mean, his story of the man of Whittlesley is interesting. And did you read Great Water or look through it at all?
I read a couple of the chapters. Yeah, I need to buy and fully read it. Is what I need to
Okay.
do.
um, you were able to read chapters without buying it? I guess there's some samples online.
On Amazon, yeah, I think you can read the first like 4 chapters is what I was able to do. I'll admit I don't buy books often. I'm used to having a university library provide all my books, and then I
Yeah,
just tell them what to buy. So I'm back in the mode of having to rebuy books for myself personally. So it's number one on my list currently on my Amazon buy list. But
nice. Appreciate it. And it is on Audible if you want a little bit cheaper. If you do audiobooks, you can
I love
listen.
audiobooks.
It's like only $10 for that versus a little bit more. But anyway, I talk about Charles Whittlesley, and doing the research of the book, I learned about a lot of these characters. Like Whittlesley, he was at the Battle of. He was an older guy quartermaster. He had worked as a geologist as a younger man. Then when the Civil War came about, he was called up because he was like in the Black Hawk War of like 1830s.
Mm.
He was either at Bull Run or Antietam, and that was his final battle. Apparently, he said he came down with a sickness, which I think was PTSD when you read through his symptoms, because he survived the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and he was like in his 50s. But the interesting thing about that is he left that battle with his sickness, and the very first thing he did was write his Smithsonian article. It's published in 1863.
I didn't know that.
It's literally like the year after he left the battle and left like the Civil War. And to me, I see that as saying, I mean, imagine how important that must have been to that guy to get that information out. That article is really good, and it's his map is fantastic, and he did it
Oh
all
yeah.
on horseback. And I put it in the GIS and geo-referenced it, and it's like perfect even to today's levels. I just try to think about that, and when I was writing it, I'm like, my gosh, the guy went through that. He's suffering severe PTSD, and what does he want to do? He wants to contribute to the first Smithsonian Institute invitation to contributions of knowledge, and he's like in his 50s, late 50s. I just feel like, and I'm gonna, I just feel like he's thinking to himself, I almost got killed. If I was killed, this would have been never got out. And, I survived that Antietam or Bull Run, which were both horrible, bloody. And he made it out. So he saw it and he was there. And it's like, so they do those little stories I came about. And then Victor Irish and Ralph Turner, they got away with murder. Those two guys they were the last two guys that had seen a woman alive, and they were suspects in a murder case. They never were
I did not
charged.
know that.
and they're from Wisconsin. So they could have been charged with murder. So their two buddies, they were out there finding copper stuff. They were fishing out in the hiding their bodies, who knows, and they found this copper. These stories, and Houghton drowns to death off the coast of Eagle River. He's trying to, he's pushing his guys, his voyagers, to get them to the next site. They were trying to get down to the southern Keweenaw, and it was like an October night. He's like, keep going. They get hit with waves. He drowns. The other people live. And, this guy was like loved. Douglas Houghton, he was a small, like 5 foot tall guy with a high pitched voice, and was just a very strange, nerdy guy, but was loved because he was a geology expert and he had seen so many rocks. And when he showed up at the Keweenaw, people like would crowd around and listen to him around the fires. He was the first to vaccinate the indigenous people around Lake Superior for smallpox. He would do that on the side. He would vaccinate on the side while he's doing geology. He was a medical doctor. And yeah, he was apparently a badass, and he pushed himself way too hard and eventually drowned. And even when they capsized, his last words were, "I'll be fine. Just go to shore. I'll see you later." And they never saw him. They didn't find him till next year. He was found frozen on the beach. He drowned. They didn't recover him till the spring thaw. And, his name, Douglas Houghton, that's what he was the first, founded the Michigan Geological Survey. I mean, interesting character anyway. But those are all in there. And, I tried to use at least the historical, traditional Anishinaabe, Ojibwe traditions to inform the fictional story of the indigenous people mining, without getting too in the weeds. The fictional story was mainly to just propose a feasible story of what happened when they mined. Like, they had to have started from the North Shore. They had to have canoed. They had to have gathered. What did it look like at the mine pits? I come up with this battering ram technology where they swing tree branches from ropes, and they have stone tips on them, and just kind of propose a realistic scenario, because there is nothing, like you said, archaeologists don't want to say anything. And in a talk I gave, we're stuck between two issues here. We have the overly conservative archaeologists and the pseudo-archaeologists. And then we also have, this is a story that is tied into religious beliefs in a way, and people's cultural views. So how do you bridge that and tell a story without being too pseudo-archaeological, without being consistent, while writing about the indigenous society as a person that's not indigenous, and doing that in a way that's still honoring their history in a respectful way? Because clearly we're not the first people on Earth to realize these are copper mines. There were people that knew about them. They weren't, I call it lost mines of Lake Superior, but it's the fictional story is them finding the remains of old copper mines. And it's all about finding this longer history. But there certainly were indigenous, they discovered this, it was already known to a lot of people. And so I looked at the book as trying to make that story known more to Western society and people like me and Americans today. Anyway, hope you get to read it. And so we've been talking almost 3 hours. Mention again your new book. Is it out? I know it's a chapter in your book and a book coming out.
Yeah, so it's a chapter in somebody else's book. It's a chapter in Michelle Beber and Christopher Wolf's book, and it's From Hard Rock to Heavy Metal: Metal Tool Production and Use by Indigenous Hunter-Gatherers in North America. And it's an edited volume, and it's really some of the most kind of the up-to-date work that researchers have been doing all around North America on metals. So there's each chapter is done by a different researcher researching a different area. There's talks of iron in there. There's talk of copper at different points in North America. And it's really a focus on hunter-gatherer use of metals all across all times and regions in North America. So if you're looking for a really good up-to-date thing, it's a good one to read and get a copy of. And it came out, I think, about 2-3 weeks ago. So it's pretty fresh off the press.
Okay, I was just going to ask. So it came out, or it's out now? Okay.
It's out. Yeah, it just came out. It came out last month. So it's out. You can buy it. This is the copy I purchased right from their website. It's from Bergham Press. You can find it off Amazon, but it is a little pricey. I'll warn you about that. But It's a good read. It comes from a Society of American Archaeology conference we all did. We all got together and presented on this, and they decided to turn this into a publication. Like I said, Michelle and Chris were leading that charge, and it's just like I said, it's really well put together, and there's a lot of good information if anybody's interested.
Cool. Well, on that note, Ryan, I think we can wrap up our conversation. Man, it's been a great conversation. Good talking with you and fleshing out some of these ideas. It's nice to talk to someone that has actually worked on Isle Royale for a couple of years.
It's not a lot of us.
I think I've been out there 4 or 5 times. I've walked across the island twice. But yeah, it's nice having that perspective and actually seeing the pits and talking to someone that's actually
An experience. Well, thank you so much for having me, Dave. I appreciate it. I had a really good time here today, and I hope you keep doing this. This is great.
Cool. Maybe I'll see you at a conference one day. All right. Bye.
All right. Bye.